All right. Good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. I am Melanie Ruiz, and I'm out of the Lincoln, Rhode Island office. And I have the pleasure today of teaching with my co-host, David Nielsen, who's also on the call. And our chat moderator is going to be actually our team leader, Kim Foley. So before we get started, I would love it if we could see all of your beautiful faces. So if you guys wouldn't mind turning on your cameras, that would be fantastic. We do ask that you stay on mute until we're, opening it up for questions and things like that, just so it's easier for people to share. But if you do have questions along the way, you can put them in the chat and Kim will help answer those. Or she'll interrupt me so that we can stop and make sure that we get all of your questions answered. Does that sound good to everybody? Sweet. All right. So again, I'm Melanie Ruiz. So I am a capper in our office. I've been in real estate for about 10 years. I'm also our MCTT. So I help our agents with setting up and training in command. And myself and Dave are also productivity coaches in our office. So we've been around for a little while. And you guys have been learning all the way through the transaction. You just finished negotiating and putting in offers. So this week we are going to work to make sure that those offers get accepted. And once they're accepted, that we can actually make sure that we get the transaction closed. Okay, so we're going to work through what happens once that deal actually is solidified and what we can do to make sure that we meet timelines, meet expectations, we keep the deal together, we keep everybody working together. What are the timelines that we need to be aware of and make sure that we meet those and what the repercussions could be if we don't. Figuring out who we need to work with, how we communicate, when we communicate, and making sure that we're providing a good level of service all the way through that transaction to not only make sure that we get to the closing table, but that we've provided good service to not only our clients, but everybody throughout the transaction, so that after the close, post-close, we can take advantage of those relationships that we've created throughout the transaction, okay? I do like to use technology, so we might get a little fancy every now and then and maybe do a breakout room or two. We'll see how it goes. I do want this to be interactive to some extent. So, I'll pause every now and then and ask people to share, ask questions, give ahas and things like that, okay? So without further ado, we're going to get started. So again, you've spent some time preparing yourself to get a transaction under contract. And now our focus is to make sure that we can keep that transaction together, because just getting an offer accepted and signing a purchase and sales agreement doesn't always necessarily mean that we're going to make it all the way through the transaction. Okay. We like to be, realistic with ourselves. That's why when we're putting together our goals for the year using the economic model, there's conversion rates in there that account for the fact that we may not close every single transaction that we put under contract. Okay. But it's our responsibility to make sure that we do the best that we can to try to get all the way to the closing table. Remember that there's 6 core competencies, right? And one of those, the 5th one, is actually coordinating the sale to closing. So that's part of our job. There's a lot of different people involved throughout the process, and we have to make sure that we do the best part, our best part in making sure that all those people are coordinated, that those timelines are met. So we are really facilitating all of the different steps, processes, people, and timelines that are happening throughout that transaction. Okay, so we're going to kind of walk through the timelines, what those timelines are, what's important about those, how to track them, what to track, and then making sure that we are doing the best that we can to avoid risk throughout the process, right? And helping our clients understand where the risks are, and other people throughout the process where those risks are. And then making sure that after we've closed the transaction, that we are taking every step that we can to continue to get revenue out of those transactions, right? Like listings, we say are leverage. Why? because we expect to get more business from every listing. Okay, same thing on the buy side. We want to make sure that we've done the best job that we can so that our clients will want to refer us out. So we have to make sure that we ask for that. And then after we've closed, we want to make sure that we continue to have those people in our database and build on those relationships. You've just helped them buy a home, right? Or sell a home. We want to continue to keep them active, right? Have them become part of our business and help us grow and get referrals and all that. And same thing with the agent that we worked your co-broke on the other side. Hopefully you've created a good relationship with them, and maybe that could lead to further relationships and business down the line, okay? And then we'll kind of do an overview, and obviously throughout we'll want you guys to share some ahas and thoughts, right? Part of this is not only to teach, but it's to mastermind. And there's a lot of really smart people on the call. So we want you guys to share ideas with each other. That's the culture of Keller Williams. So we want to take advantage of that mind share while we're on today, okay? Any questions before we get started? All right, so in the MREA, Gary Keller says that real estate transactions aren't particularly trouble-free, right? It doesn't mean that once you get it signed, whoo, now we're just running to the closing date, right? That's not necessarily the truth. It's a strenuous and trying time that requires all the attention and effort you can command. You've probably heard some agents say, and I've said it to clients before too, that especially on the buy side, finding the house actually isn't the hardest part of the job. It's once we find the house, making sure that we actually close and get to buy the house. That's really where the hard work comes in, okay? So we're gonna help you guys with creating those timelines and figuring out steps and actions and things that you can put in place to make sure that you do the best job at that as you possibly can, okay? All right, so let's start with timelines. And I'm just gonna take a peek at your participant guide to make sure that I can direct you once we get there. So just like getting a lead doesn't automatically make that person a contact or a client, right? Same thing with getting under contract. Just because you get under contract doesn't mean that you automatically will close and get paid, right? So we can't make that assumption. There's unfortunately a lot of areas or steps within the process that could actually lead to that deal falling apart. And so our goal is to know what those areas are and how to manage our clients and the other people in the transaction, managing that risk to make sure that you guys are in control and can get us to the closing table, right? Who on here, by raising your hand, your digital hand, has actually bought or sold a house? Okay, so David, I'm going to call on you again. So David, tell me, what did you have to do after you signed the contract? And this is you personally buying or selling a house, right? Either you sold your own house or you bought your own house, right? What did you have to do after you signed that contract as a consumer?
I'm not sure I remember. I know that sounds crazy. I guess we did inspections. We did. Like I wasn't really involved. My sister Chloe,
Right.
who's with KW, like I don't know.
She was our agent at the time.
Yeah, a lot of times the consumer, they're not the ones that are actually doing all the work, right? It's the real estate agent really that's coordinating with a bunch of different people to make sure the transaction is happening, right? So it's you, as we'll talk on the buy side, you as a buyer's agent, it's you and the co-broke listing agent that are the ones that are making the closing happen, right? So you're making sure that all the right people are involved and covering all the steps. That's not the responsibility of the consumer. So it's our job to make sure that we understand where everybody needs to be when and what they all should be doing, and how do we best communicate that amongst everybody in the transaction, right? This is a stressful time for the consumer. And like David said, they didn't necessarily remember what to do or know what to do. They're just kind of sitting back like, here, I'm going to give you hundreds of thousands of dollars, and then I'm just going to sit here and wait and hope that everything turns out okay, right? So that's a lot of emotion, and you've got to be able to help manage that, right? And make sure that the relationships with everybody in the transaction allow you to do that in a way that removes stress for the consumer. Go ahead, David.
So I'm going to buy myself a t-shirt. I saw it yesterday on Amazon. It said something like this: top 10 reasons to work with me as your, or top 10 things to get your house sold. Number 1, contact me. I'll take care of the other 9. Or something
Yes.
like that.
Yep, it's exactly the thought process that you should have as a real estate agent is you want to provide a level of service, right? We say this a lot. It's make the most amount of money in the least amount of time with the least amount of stress. That's a huge value add to a consumer, right? On the sell side, sellers want you to market their house, number 1, and then they want you to do that and get them the most money in the least amount of time, and they don't want the stress. A buyer wants to buy his house for a fair price with as little stress as possible. So you've got to be able to manage where those stress points can be and the timing around those stress points, and making sure that you set the right expectation and use the right communication to remove some of that stress and help manage all the different parts and people that are involved in the process that allow you to do that for your client, right? All right, so did everybody, they're referencing in here the contracts that you've done in previous sessions. Does everyone have a contract from a previous session? If you don't, I created a sample one. So do we want to use the sample or go off of what you guys have used in the past? Sample, raise your hand that I've got, or do you have a previous one? My sample, okay. I'm trying to
Melanie,
see
may I
everybody. Huh?
I wanted to interject just because we have agents here from multiple states, so there could be some differences in contracts and processes. So please all understand that, you know, Melanie and our experiences in Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Connecticut, where we're all licensed, and even within those 3 states, the processes are a little different. So understand that there may be some differences in what we're saying versus what may actually be happening in your own markets.
Yes. So in your participant guide, I think it's 19.3, you'll see 3 timelines, okay? So we're gonna work through some deadlines in the contract and the transaction. For this portion, we're just gonna focus in the center, which is just the transaction, okay? So the first or the middle little timeline on that diagram. And I'm gonna stop sharing for just a second. I'm gonna pull up a sample contract. And we can use that as a guide, and we'll work together on what some of the deadlines are that we would see in a transaction. Bear with me while I pull that up. And feel free to interject, ask questions and all that while I'm pulling this up.
While Melanie is looking for this, I just want to double down on some of the points that she's already made, right? So I always tell my clients once we get under contract, I'm like, hey, I'm excited because now my job is really starting. And like managing these deadlines, like again, speaking differences state to state, in Rhode Island, where I do 95% of my business, for inspection period very specifically, we have a period of 10 business days. And as the buyer's like, oh, well, that seems plenty of time to do my inspection. I will have to explain to them, it's like, no, it's not just doing your inspection, right? It's not just having John Q inspector come out and look at the property and tell you the heating system's great. You also have to review the report that they give you. You have to negotiate any repairs or credits you want after that and get everything signed. And that all has to happen within that window. And I don't expect my buyers to understand that, especially first-time buyers with whom I work very frequently. As David suggested earlier, he's bought a house in his life and didn't remember the next part of the process. If you've done it before and have a real estate license, imagine how somebody who's never done it before and has 0 experience in real estate is going to feel. So understanding where these pitfalls and timelines are and how much time you have to do tasks A, B, and C, super, super important.
Okay, so we're going to talk about not on the buy side or the sell side specifically, just in a real estate transaction, from the time that you write your contract to the time that you actually close, what those really important deadlines are. Okay, so can you guys call out, put it in the chat, some of the deadlines that you know are kind of the biggest deadlines in a transaction once you've accepted an offer? You guys can just take yourselves off mute and share.
We did just talk through one of the largest ones, which is the inspection contingency deadline.
David said initial deposit. Yep. That's a deadline. That's right on, that's the first part of our purchase and sales agreement is when you have to get the deposit in. Yep, so we can add that to the timeline. What are the two sort of main areas where you think a deal could fall apart?
The funding deadline.
Funding, yep.
Mhm.
Anybody else?
We've got in the chat, Melanie, we've got a lot of people saying inspections, we've got appraisal, we've got financing, we've got mortgage contingency.
Yep,
Good job, guys.
exactly. Yeah. So let's just start with kind of the first one that I see on the list, the deposit. So typically in our area, we have to provide the EMD or earnest money deposit, the original deposit, within 48 hours. Is that sort of similar to everybody else's area? So that's probably the first step on the timeline, right? So on that timeline in the middle, you want to put your EMD date. And then, guys, this is for you. So make notes however you want to. If you want to make, little acronyms and jot it down, whatever is easiest for you, but jot down your initial EMD deposit. So that's a good one. And then I see we got inspections, right? So inspections is another one. So again, in our area, and obviously, guys, every contract can have exceptions, right? So there's sort of the standard process or standard contract and the normal amount of time that's in there. And then obviously, as we tell our agents, there's a section in every contract that allows you to say, except for XYZ contingency or except for XYZ situation, right? But generally speaking, in our area, you have a 10-day inspection period. Okay, so we'll focus on Rhode Island. Rhode Island, there's a 10-day inspection period. So let's put that on our timeline because that's one of the big ones, right? And as Dave mentioned, in our area, 10 days is the entire amount of time that you have to perform the inspections, any follow-up inspections. So let's say you go to the initial home inspection and the inspector says that there's something with the electric that is of concern and that you should have a licensed electrician, right? Then it's the buyer's responsibility, unless otherwise agreed upon, to have an electrician go out to the property and take care of or look at whatever that additional issue or concern is, right? Or if it's plumbing or if it's foundation, that 10-day window is not for you to just do the inspection and then 2 weeks later have a plumber come out, right? So in our area, you've got 10 days to get every inspection done that you're needed to, get the results back from that inspection, and then communicate any either repair requests or credits that you're asking for from the other side within that 10 days.
May I share an example of where people kind of lose sight of this sometimes too, Melanie?
Yep.
Is everybody familiar with radon and how you might test for radon in a home? Some inspection companies do have apps that will give like real-time readings to the inspector, like from that little machine that's in the property that's, that the buyer is buying. But some companies, and actually the company I use primarily for my Massachusetts transactions, they do the old canister. So they have to leave a canister in the house for 48 hours. And then you, as the agent, need to go pick up, the buyer's agent, excuse me, have to go pick up that little canister and then bring it to the post office, where it gets sent in the mail to some office in some other state. And then they have to review that. The radon alone can take 4 or 5 days from when you actually get into the inspection. And then what if the radon comes high, which, by the way, guys, 4.0 picocuries per liter is the EPA recommended action limit for radon. I don't know what a picocurie is, but I know I want less than 4 of them. If you have more than 4, you might want to negotiate for your buyer a radon mitigation system. That might take time too, because that's not cheap. That can be between like $1,200 and $1,800. So that alone might cost you a week or 70% of your inspection timeline. Just stuff to think about.
So you want to try to get your actual home inspection scheduled as early on as possible. So offers accepted, I'm calling, or my clients are calling the home inspector like that day to try to get that inspection scheduled as soon as possible, because in the event that there are additional things they need to have looked at, you want to allow enough time for that to happen. Also, if you know that your inspector is not available, or the additional follow-up, if you know it's radon and you're in an area where it takes longer, then you would want to put that either into the purchase and sales agreement as a longer inspection period, or after it's signed, talk to the listing agent right away and say, hey, we're going to need a few extra days for the inspection period because, for example, the radon is going to take a little bit longer. Don't wait until day 9 or 10 to have that conversation, right? Because we assume that everybody wants a transaction to come together, right? The listing agent, the buyer's agent, the seller, the buyer, we all want this to work out. You cannot wait on assumptions to take action. You should head off that potential risk earliest in the process as possible, so that in the event there is an issue, that you can hit that earlier in the process and alleviate some stress and hopefully, you know, alleviate any potential issues, right? All right, so inspections, great. What else do we have? Someone had appraisal in here. That's another big one. So where does appraisal happen in the process? Anybody, you guys can just, if I ask a question, you guys can just come off mute and answer.
Lindsay says right away.
Hopefully.
Hopefully.
Okay. Anybody else? So, yeah, so appraisal, you don't necessarily have a specific date that it has to be done. In our contracts, I'm just going to scroll down to that area of our agreement. So in our contracts now in Rhode Island, unfortunately, we have several variations of our forms. So depending on which one you choose, we'll tell you where the section is on where that mortgage contingency or appraisal information is found. Okay, so in the Rhode Island contract, and this one was as of 2021, so this is the most current version that you can get from the board. There is a section in here that says when they will apply and when they will have their mortgage commitment date. Does anybody want to take a shot at what explaining the mortgage commitment or mortgage contingency date is? And if you shy, don't worry about it, but I want to allow an opportunity for you guys. All right, so your mortgage contingency date is essentially, in the simplest terms, the bank has taken all of the necessary steps to ensure that the buyer is financially capable to get the mortgage on the property, okay? Based on the terms that were laid out in the purchase and sales agreement, and on the mortgage commitment date or mortgage contingency date, the lender is required to typically provide a document, a mortgage commitment letter of some sort, and that says, we have, you know, reviewed all the information for the buyer, and based on what we have thus far, we can say that they are approved to get the mortgage, essentially, okay? Sometimes you'll have a conditional commitment, and that looks something like, we have done everything that we need to do. The buyer is approved for the mortgage, with the exception of reviewing X documents or getting back X document or pulling credit. So there might be where they're saying, we have commitment, except there's a few things that we need to take care of, okay? So typically in Rhode Island, the mortgage commitment date happens after the appraisal, right? Because if the appraisal comes in under the amount that they're using to the purchase price of the property, then we may need to change things in the agreement, right? So typically you want to track your mortgage commitment date, and you're going to want to make sure that the appraisal happens before the mortgage commitment date. So again, this is one of those areas where you as the agent, we have our agents, we tell all of our agents in our office, because we're in productivity coaching, we tell them that once you get a purchase and sales agreement, all the dates that are outlined in here, like your closing date, your commitment date, when they will apply for a mortgage, your inspection period, when that ends, all those dates, we tell them to put them in their calendar with a 4-day reminder so that it pops up for you 4 days before it's due. That allows you an opportunity to address any potential concerns. So if your mortgage commitment date is coming up, if you have a reminder in your calendar 4 days before, and you haven't gotten the appraisal scheduled yet, then you should probably have a conversation, right? So on your timeline, I would make sure that you put mortgage contingency, and then a few days before that, minimal, you want to put the appraisal. Okay, so that's another date, another activity in the timeline that you guys want to be tracking when it comes to a transaction. Is there anything in the chat that we should cover? All right. Okay, any other big dates or deadlines in a transaction that we should put here on our timeline?
I'd like to throw in kind of an outside the box one that does certainly not apply to all deals, but if you are representing a buyer as an example, and that seller needs to find a property of their own to purchase, we call that seller suitable housing, then that will be a separate addenda that is referenced in a purchase and sales agreement. And then, at least in Rhode Island, the seller suitable housing is its own form that has to be filled, and you set out deadlines. And super fun, it actually, you can in that document change the way some of these other deadlines work. So give you even more stuff to pay attention to in terms of keeping track of your timelines and getting your deals from contract to closing.
Yep. The other thing I'll mention, just to chat about the other, because I know we're in New England, so we've probably got people from other states. We're kind of focused on Rhode Island, but for your timelines, if you're only operating in Massachusetts or Connecticut, you can just adjust the dates if it's different. I know that Connecticut is very similar to Rhode Island in that, one deposit, you write a purchase and sales agreement with the inspection period in that agreement. Massachusetts is a bit different. They actually have 2 separate deposits, so you might want to jot that down. We talked about one of the important dates is actually making sure that the earnest money or EMD deposit, offer deposit, is sent in on time. In Massachusetts, you have a second time where you put in a second deposit, and that's at purchase and sales agreement. So you probably want to jot that one down. And in Massachusetts, you actually sign an offer contract, you perform inspections, and then you write your purchase and sales date, or excuse me, a purchase and sales agreement. So in the timeline for you guys, you want to make sure that you have purchase and sales date as a specific deadline to make sure that you get back your purchase and sales agreement by that date. And again, give yourself a reminder a few days in advance so that you're not waiting until the very last minute to do that. Okay. Any questions, additions, comments? Go ahead, David.
Yeah, quick question. So with those, could you two share, or the three of you share, how logistically you do that? I get in my mind, sure, put on a calendar. Do you go with paper? Do you have a whiteboard with all your ongoing transactions? Do you just do electronic combination? I need this to become efficient. Only 30 days in, I can avoid bad habits by starting fresh, maybe the right way.
Perfect question. So that's actually what we're going to do. We have one more sort of section that we're going to cover, and then we're actually going to have you guys work on creating a buyer specific timeline, what those dates are, what the communication is, how that communication should look, and then we'll do the same activity on the seller side, and we're going to kind of brainstorm together. So super question. That's exactly what we're going to cover in just a few minutes. Okay. All right. So we've kind of got our timeline together, and we'll hash some more of this out as we get through the rest of the sections. So let me just get back to the presentation. Bear with me while I push some crazy buttons. Thanks for your patience, guys, with all of the little pop-ups that show up. And all right. So we went through sort of the deadlines. We talked about what some of those areas are that we need to make sure that we're watching the dates, because those dates will have repercussions if they're not met, right? So now we talked about the when, so now let's talk about the who, right? So if you think about all the people that are involved in a transaction, because remember we said as the real estate agent, a lot of your job is coordinating all of the different people and deadlines, right? So you're dealing with a lot of different individuals in the transaction beside yourself. So let's chat a little bit and brainstorm about who some of those other people are in the transaction. So we know we've got a buyer and a seller, right? You've got a listing agent and obviously, hopefully a buyer's agent. Who else do you think we have in the transaction that we need to help sort of coordinate with? You guys can shout them out, put them in the chat. Mortgage person, lawyer, yep.
Escrow,
Inspector,
title.
escrow. Who else? And I know different states will have different answers, so feel free to shout them out, even if you're not from Rhode Island. Think about all the different parts of the process, right? Home inspectors, yep. Title company. Lender, right? That's where they're getting the money from. What happens if they're using a mortgage company? Appraiser, Jason's got it, exactly. Yep. Yeah, if they're on septic and private well, those are separate inspectors that you're going to need during the home inspection period. If they're using a lender and they need to get an appraiser, or
termite,
they do need to get an appraiser, go ahead.
termite,
Termite inspector, yeah, especially if you're using what type of loan, guys? So FHA may require a home termite inspection. VA, that's right. So with VA loans, a termite inspection is required. Cleaning service, yes, junk removal, that has become very, very popular in our area. Movers, yes, moving companies, how are they going to get to their new place? What if they need work done at the new property? They're going to be doing some remodeling before they move in. You might need a contractor. Or if they're using a construction loan, then you're definitely going to need to work with a contractor. They're going to be a huge part of the process. What about some people that aren't really necessary, but always like to be involved? This is Dave Nielsen's favorite.
I do love this. I will give the answer that I think you're baiting me on. If you want me to jump in with it.
Yes, go right ahead.
Mom and dad.
Yeah, and
Family
guys,
members.
we kind of joke about that, but that's actually like a real thing that comes into play. And if we're talking about managing expectations and helping to avoid risk, you really do need to know how to deal with them because they could be the biggest part of a transaction, right? If you have first-time home buyers who are younger, right? And maybe a little bit unsure and they're having mom and dad involved in the process, they need to either become your ally or they'll be your enemy. So being able to deal with other people in the transaction that may not necessarily be the buyer or seller, but will have a big impact on the decision your client makes. You definitely need to make sure that they're involved in the transaction the way that you need or want them to be involved, and how to manage some of that emotion, right, that comes up during a transaction. Is there anybody else you guys can think of that we maybe didn't cover? I couldn't think of anything else. I don't know if you guys have any
Just-
other ideas.
I did want to
Fire.
throw.
Yes, we need a
department?
smoke inspection. Go ahead, who is that? I just spoke over someone.
That was me. I'm sorry. Smoke inspection not required in Connecticut, by the way,
Mhm.
which I didn't know until my first Connecticut deal. So we're talking about state to state differences. Melanie, you were saying something earlier that I have now put into a lot of my presentations with clients about the idea of going for the most amount of money for your sellers anyway, most amount of money in the least amount of time and the least amount of stress. I really think a lot about that stress one and anything that I might need to manage throughout the transaction. When you're doing your buyer consultation or your listing appointment, that's the best time to think about any situation that might bring stress into the transaction that you want to avoid, and setting the expectation of where that where that might arise. When I have my buyers, I make light of it because I don't want to tell them that, you know, mom and dad can't come to the inspection as an example. I don't want to create this confrontational relationship, but I might share a story or two about where mom and dad have come to inspections in the past and they made things a little more complicated. Just like, hey, remember that, you know, the inspector is a paid professional who's been doing this for decades and looks at properties. And if it's somebody you use frequently, say like, I have a great relationship with this inspector. They've got great bedside manner, so they know how to communicate what's important. They know how to answer your questions. And I think we should keep that kind of like in the professional realm, because you start to recognize where your transactions might fall apart. And at those early appointments, that's where you can set the expectation and get ready to, you know, defend that deal going forward, so to speak.
Yeah, and I'll share a couple of thoughts too, because some of the questions that we get often, especially from newer agents, is, do I give them a home inspector? Do I find the home inspector? Do I find the attorney? Do I find the mortgage company, right? So there's a lot of different school of thoughts. So the way that we typically position it is, we can provide recommendations to our clients, right? And amongst agents, we obviously ourselves would love and prefer that they work with the people that we know and trust, right? Because we feel that they're going to do a better job. They understand and know us as agents and what our expectations are because we've done business together before, right? But you have to be very careful also, because if you are the person that's telling them they should use this certain person, if something goes wrong, who are they going to come after? So let's say you recommend a home inspector, right? Post-closing, there's a water leak, there's termites, there's all these issues, right? Who is your client going to call? They'll probably call you anyway, but they're almost, it's, even if they don't say it, they're sort of going to blame you because you were the person that told them they should use that inspector, right? Hopefully it doesn't get to that point, but sometimes it even gets to a point of litigation where they may be looking to be financially taken care of for any issues that come up. You don't want to be the person that's responsible for telling them they have to use a certain person, right? So and guys, chime in and share how you guys approach this. Again, this is a mastermind. We'd love to hear how other people are doing this. I know for myself, I typically give 2 or 3 recommendations and say, these are folks that I've worked with, I trust, and clients have had a good experience with in the past. But you are free to choose whomever you'd like. So in the case of inspectors, you can Google home inspectors. In the case of attorneys, same thing, same conversation, right? Here's my recommendations. I trust them, or I've worked with them. Clients have had a good experience, but you are welcome to use whoever you'd like.
Mel, we have
anybody
a
have-
question in the chat.
Sure.
Do you personally go to those inspections with your clients, or do you have somebody from your team cover, or not at all?
Awesome. Does anybody else want to share? Other than just us? Answer that question, share how you approach that? No?
If you
Jason,
don't
you
have an
came off
answer,
mute. Do you want to share?
So I like to be at the home inspection so I can, one, it's just a learning experience for me. And I know I've heard 2 schools of thought for maybe the listing agent, and I'm talking about as a listing agent, I like to be there. I've heard that you should be a part of it, and I've also heard that you shouldn't be, and the reasonings behind why. So I'd like to hear from you guys about what you think about whether or not a list agent should be there. I have been there, and I just had my first close. We're actually in the middle of my first closing.
Congratulations.
And thank you. And I was there, and there were some material defects uncovered that of course we had to disclose, but because they came out in the report. But I saw what they were pointing out and going through and looking at. So it kind of, put me on the hook for it. But it would have come out anyway. So I just I want to hear from you, what you think about, the listing agent being there, through those, those processes.
Yeah, so I'll share. Oh, Roland, were you going to say something?
I was going to say to Jason, it's depending on your relationship with the people you work with. If
Yeah.
you never, for example, someone is doing the home inspection and I never met them, I'll be there. So is the appraiser, I'll be there. Normally, I assist the appraisal. I don't say anything. I just bring my comps and I just hand the comps to the appraiser. And for him to take those comps that I pull out as a consideration. So I would say it would be depending on your relationship with the people you work.
Yeah, that's huge. So I would agree
Good
with that.
answer.
I think every situation is different, right? And so first of all, we're all independent contractors, right? So how I operate is not the way that Dave operates, is not the way that Jason operates. We probably do some similar things, but we're very different people, right? And that's why the clients that we work with choose to work with us, right? So there isn't really a rule around most of this. It really comes down to, for me, it's one, where am I adding value? And where could I be maybe not doing the best for my client? And I need to pay attention to my client and everybody else in the transaction. So that, Roland, I love that you explained it that way. It really depends. And I know that's kind of annoying answer, but it really does. So just as an example, if I have a seller that is not going to do any work, it's as is, they don't have money, means, desire to do any work to the house. And if I can provide a newer agent an opportunity to go to a home inspection and learn, right, then I may not necessarily go to that home inspection, because even if I hear something, I know I have to disclose it. And that's important, guys. What you know, you have to disclose. So if you go to a home inspection and you learn things that you didn't know, you now have the responsibility to disclose, right? And two, it doesn't matter if they disclose, because my client is not going to do anything. Now, the buyer can still ask for repairs or credits or whatever they'd like, but I know in the back of my mind, it doesn't matter to my seller, because regardless of what happens, they are not going to do any work. So in that scenario, I may allow another agent to cover that home inspection on the list side for me, because I'm not going to add any value. And because I know certain information, that may not allow me to do what's best for my seller in the future. And I can provide an opportunity to another agent to cover that inspection for me. And like Emily mentioned, that's like a home inspection is huge value to a newer agent. So, use it as an opportunity for learning. Absolutely. If you can use a situation for another agent to learn, I think that's a huge factor as well. Dave, I'll let you jump in.
Yes, please. So, especially when I was starting my career working mostly with buyers, I didn't know anything about houses when I got my license. I could barely tell the difference between a window and a door, right? So like everything I know about property now, I learned because I went to inspections and I followed those inspectors around and I asked questions. And they'd be like, oh, this is knob and tube electrical. I'll be like, oh, how do you know? Can you point that out so I can identify it for my clients in the future? I mentioned radon earlier. I know how radon mitigation systems work, not because I ever had a job as a radon mitigation system installer, but because I ask inspectors questions at inspections. And I say, well, what does this mechanism do? Like, explain this to me. So everything I know about houses, I learned at inspections. So yeah, absolutely. As a value add for yourself and your own education, fantastic to be there. But as Melanie was saying, it really does depend. And Melanie, you've heard me say this a bunch of times, and I'm just going to share one of my favorite Dave-isms here. When we're coaching and teaching, we like to explain how things should work or how they do work in a real estate transaction. And then you can sprinkle in some real world experience about how they actually do work. There is one listing that I have currently that is closing next week where the buyer wanted to conduct their inspection. I know that my seller, and I'm not going to speak ill of my seller, but my seller is not willing to leave her property. She has mobility issues and she's like, I need to stay here. It's really kind of a big pain for me to vacate the building. I also know that she has this friend who comes over like every day and I'm not joking, pours a couple of drinks of vodka and sits there and gets drunk with her in the middle of the afternoon. So I know that during this inspection, both of these individuals who like to talk and drink are probably going to be present. So I go to that inspection because I'm playing defense. I don't want them to say anything to the buyer that maybe isn't appropriate. Oh yeah, I'm not judging David, not at all. And I don't want them to share anything. Not that I want them to share anything, but I don't want them to say anything that maybe isn't appropriate to say to a buyer. I'm trying, like later in this presentation, I'm going to be talking about risk aversion, and that's a big one. I wanted to play defense around that. Or we talked about, like I was joking earlier about how, you know, mom and dad come to home inspections. I have absolutely had a buyer who has, in this case, was his father, who almost seemed to enjoy blowing up deals for his son and pointing out all of these things. I went to all of those inspections because I felt like I had to play defense for the transaction. Now, of course, I don't want them to hide anything that I think the buyer needs to know, but this guy had a way of making mountains out of molehills. So these are like, as you kind of see the different conversations that happen during a transaction, and some that are relevant and appropriate and some that are definitely not, you kind of need to understand where you might need to interject yourself. So that's a very long-winded way of saying it depends on, you know, if I'm going to go to these things personally. I do like to be there because if anything comes up, I want to be the one defending it, but that doesn't mean that I'm at every single one.
Valerie, you raised your hand, go ahead. Oh,
You're
still
muted,
on.
Valerie.
Sorry. So, does the listing agent go to the inspection or just the buyer's agent with the inspector? Or does it like, you know, I think, because I did have 2 closings in my lifetime, but a very long time ago. I think I was at the inspection as the listing agent, but I was told to just shut my mouth and just be there. Like, don't bring anything up. Is that correct? And is it
Yeah, so-
common for the, go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, so that's where we're saying it depends on the situation. So you are not required to be there as a listing agent unless your seller wants you to be there, or if you feel like there's a situation where you should protect their belongings, or you know the home inspector is the kind of guy that will pick the house apart and you want to be able to curb some of the concerns. And some people love to be at them as a listing agent, not wrong. Some listing agents feel they don't need to be there, not wrong. So it's really up to you. Again, can you add value? Are you helping to avoid any potential concerns, right? If not, maybe you don't need to be there and you can allow another agent an opportunity to be there so that they can learn from the home inspection. Maybe they've never been to one. And I'm just going to throw it out there, guys. If you're a high producing agent, I'm sorry, but you don't have the time to be at every single 2 to 3 hour home inspection that you're going to be having a listing for. I mean, can you imagine, you know, as a single agent, they say you can do about 36 transactions, 24 to 36 transactions before you get administrative support. Can you imagine having 12 listings at the same time? You need to go to the home inspections for all 12 and take care of your other 12 to 20 clients at a high level if you're going to every 2 or 3 hour home inspection. Not a wrong
Such a good
answer
point.
either way. Just you sort of have to, can I add value? Am I doing something to help avoid problems? And if not, be okay with maybe you don't go to it. Maybe you could be using that time to better serve other clients or add value to other people, and rather than going to that inspection.
So one final question. On the buy end, as the buyer's agent, I definitely need to be there with the inspector when the inspection happens, correct?
I mean, I do. Again, unless, let's say it's an investor of mine that I've worked with for a long time, and I know that he knows what he's doing and he doesn't necessarily need me to be at the home inspection, or if it's a client that has bought and sold multiple times, or it's a contractor, or specific situations where I know that that buyer doesn't necessarily need me to be there because I'm not going to add value. There's no situations at risk that I need to help avoid. So I don't need to be there. But most of the time as a buyer's agent, it's very likely that you're going to be there for the home inspection for the buyer.
Thank you.
Does anybody want to add to that or share how they manage things?
I want to throw an Ignite specific point on this. So, guys, I'm teaching Ignite in person in my market center, and just last week we did session 2, which, if you don't remember, and I don't blame you if you don't, one of the big things is the core competencies, the 6 core competencies. One of those is managing money, and when it says managing the money, it's your money. You're not an employee, you're a business owner. So you're managing your own money, your own revenue stream, and your own expenses, right? So Melanie was making a great point. If you are a high producing agent and you've got, 24 to 36 transactions per year, it takes a lot of time to go to an inspection sometimes. Again, my furthest listing that I currently have is about an hour from my home. If it's a 2.5 hour inspection and an hour back, that's literally half my day. So if you guys are truly managing money and you're moving from E to P, then you should be tracking your value as in your dollar per hour. So you should have some semblance of an idea of, when I'm lead generating, my time is worth X $100 per hour. When I'm at an inspection, my time is worth, I bet it's significantly less than several $100s an hour, which, by the way, most of top producing agents value per hour is between $200 and $500 per hour when lead generating. So I would really rather not spend 4 hours managing an inspection when I could spend 4 hours making $200, $300, $400, $500 per hour. That's kind of that's the E to P, very purposeful business owner way to look at that. Now, if my seller insists that I be there, if my buyer insists that I be there, fine, because really the root of the industry is service to your clients. Sacrifice nothing in order to provide better service to your clients. But if my seller's like, I don't really care. It's commonplace for Connecticut for many agents not to be present at things. Listing agents are very rarely at showings in Connecticut, but my Connecticut seller really wants me to be there. So what am I going to say to them? Well, no, that's not really common in Connecticut. I'm not going to go to showings and I'm not going to go to the inspection. No, my seller wants me there, so I'm going to provide that service and be there. But if you have the option, understand that managing your money is one of the things that you should be considering.
All right, I'm going to move us on just because I want to make sure that we get you guys the tactical walk away from here things that you need to walk away with. Okay, so we're going to transition off of the who, the what, and now we're going to get into the when. Okay, so we kind of went through the basic timeline of or the deadlines in a transaction. Now we're going to break that down a little bit deeper into the timeline for a buyer specifically. So this is you representing the buyer. So if you go back to your participation guide, we're going to go back to that same page, which is 19.3. And we're going to do the top timeline is going to be on the buyer side. Okay. On page 19.5, there's a bunch of pieces that you need to consider when you're putting together the timeline. And I am going to put you into breakout rooms because you guys are a little quiet and I'm going to force you to interact a little bit. Okay. So when we think about the buyer side, some of the questions that you want to ask yourself is, what's the first thing that my buyer needs, right? What's the very first thing they need? Just kind of start at the beginning and think about, where do I start? Where's my point A, right? Think about, what do they need to know? Like, what do I have to tell them? What do they need to be aware of? And what do they need to do? Have to. Your buyer has to do this action, right? When do I need to know or be aware of things? And when do I need to take an action as an agent? What does everyone else in the transaction need to know? When do they have to take an action? Okay, what is that action? And then what am I doing at every point that we just considered? What am I as the agent doing to make sure that I bulletproof the transaction? And in Shift, they talk about this like crazy. Like when the market is changing, keeping your transaction together becomes so much more important. And you need to have very specific activities or actions that you're doing to make sure that that transaction is actually going to get to a close, right? So in your pamphlet, there's a 19.5. Okay, so we're going to cover this a little bit and then I'm going to put you guys in breakout rooms. Okay, So what you need to consider is, when do I need to be communicating with my client and everyone else during the process, right? So if you think about that timeline or deadline that we created, right? Break that down into a buyer situation. When do I need to tell people about the deadline? Right? So if I know the inspection period is 10 days from now, when do I need to start talking to people like the home inspector, the septic inspector, the client? When do I need to tell them what these deadlines are? When do I need to share documentation throughout the process with people? So I get a brand new purchase and sales agreement. What do I do with it? Who does it go to? When does it go to them? Okay. Then you need to think about, when does the buyer and the lender communicate, right? So just as an example, one of the scripts I always tell my clients when I'm going through a buyer consult, we just did the wants and needs analysis. We've walked through the expectations and the process, right? We get through the home inspection. Then I tell my client, now you and I talk a couple times, maybe once a week, and you're going to be talking to your lender every few days, right? Like the next 2 weeks after that whole set of processes, now you're going to be communicating with the lender on a regular basis, and you're going to have to send another a pay stub and another bank statement. And yes, you're going to have to send that same document that you've already sent. You're going to have to send that another 4 or 5 times, right? So helping your buyer understand who they're going to be talking to and when, right? When you give them that list of inspector recommendations, when do you do that? What does it look like? Okay. When do you set up time to actually communicate with people? Is it proactive, or are you putting those things on your calendar in advance to make sure that you don't miss them? Or do you have a smart plan that you've put in command so that it reminds you when you need to do these certain activities, or checklists, which we'll talk about later? Okay. After you do your home inspection, what if they're not happy and they need to either get a credit or a pay request? When do I do that? Who does it go to? What does it look like? Okay. And then on the document side, what types of material or paperwork or documents do I need to give to my client, the lender, the attorney, right? Like, when do I do those things? Who does it go to? Who needs to sign it? Who needs to be involved in the decision-making process, right? So different states require different things. In Massachusetts, it's an attorney state. So an attorney typically will write the purchase and sales agreement, but at minimum has to review it. In Rhode Island, we can use a title company. So who needs to review and be a part of the decision-making process, and when, and who do they need to communicate with? How are they going to communicate? Is it email? Is it phone call? Is it Zoom, right? So 19.5, keep that open in front of you and just refer back to that. I'm going to put you guys in breakout rooms, and I want you to kind of put together what you think a buyer timeline should look like based on all of those pieces of information. We're going to give you a decent amount of time, about 10 minutes, and then we're going to come back and we'll share and mind meld a little bit. Okay. Now let me see if I can make this breakout room thing happen. It's been a minute. And anybody can share, chat, ask questions while I do this.
Is anybody licensed in a state other than Rhode Island, Massachusetts, or Connecticut?
I'm New Hampshire and Mass.
New Hampshire and Mass, beautiful.
Roland's out in
Now-
California. but
Yeah, Roland's in
Very tough one.
Cali.
Can you put up that timeline briefly so I can take a picture of it? Because I don't have it available to me now.
Yes. Oh, sorry. Does anybody not have the participant guide? So here's a sample one. If you guys want to take a little snapshot of this, it's not in your booklet, but if you want to use that for this exercise to give you some idea.
Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, so I'm going to put you guys in breakout rooms, and right now we're just covering the buyer side. This is if you are representing the buyer. Okay. All right, so here we go. let me. Come on, give me
That's
one
great.
second
Well-
here.
While
Right.
Melanie does this, we were just as an aside, guys, while we were talking about how to prepare for this session, I said, "Oh, are we gonna have to do breakout rooms? Because I don't know how to do that."
All right, I think
I'm
I've got
glad
it.
Melanie took the horn.
You got 10 minutes and we'll see you back here. All right, so we are back and our breakout rooms, you guys were chatting about specifically the timeline for a buyer. So can we have a couple of people raise their hand? It would be awesome if we could have one person from each room or group raise their hand and share what you went through and kind of give us an overview of what your timeline looks like, and then we can compare that to what other people came up with. So Valerie, go ahead.
Okay, so that was not enough time at all.
I know.
I had my paperwork and I'm like, oh shoot, but like I said, I did sell a couple of houses back in 2018, but I have not been on the buy end. So I was doing it sort of backwards. So basically, then I found out that the person in my room is someone from Massachusetts. So then I switched it real quick because I sold in New Hampshire and one in Mass. But so basically, okay, hey, buyer, great news. Owner, the seller accepted your offer. This is what we need to do. And time is of the essence. The first thing you need to do is contact the an inspector. Okay. I have a couple of names unless you know somebody. I know one guy and he's like a one-stop shop. So if you call him, he usually has connections to either a septic or a radon, but this was Massachusetts. It didn't apply. But I'm just saying, if you can give them I'm going to go quick. So they need to
No,
contact
you
their
don't have to rush.
inspector.
We have time. Don't feel like you have to rush. We got time.
Okay. So time is of the essence. So you need to call an inspector immediately, and then set that up. Once that happens, they'll get that report back to you within such a time. You and I will review it and decide, hey, this needs to be fixed by the seller, or the seller needs to give us the money to fix it at closing. And Mr. Buyer, you also need to contact your mortgage company as soon as possible. Let them know seller accepted your offer, so that they can finish the process of your approval, and set the appraisal, set a time for the appraiser. It's very important that you keep in constant contact with your lender. He's going to be asking you for lots of information. Please don't be overwhelmed, but know that this is something that is part of the process. We also will need to contact the seller and let the seller know when all these things are happening, because they obviously need to vacate the house during this time. Also, if it's the state of Massachusetts, you should contact your attorney as soon as possible. If you don't have one yet, I know you didn't need it before, but now you do, because the closing is going to happen. Yay, congratulations, you got an offer. And you coordinate that. Then as the day of the closing, we're going to do a final walkthrough. We're going to go through the house and make sure the seller did what they said they were going to do, and that they removed all of their personal items. There's no trash, it's not bad. And then we'll go to closing. Congratulations. Did I do good?
Awesome.
Woo!
Good job. Yay.
right.
Yay.
Melanie
I
just
love
gave
that
us
you
her-
also you provided the timeline and you gave awesome scripts all throughout that. That was I love that.
Coffee kicked in.
I want to clap my hands for a moment too, Melanie. You just said one of my favorite words is script. Guys, we talk often about script practice and role play and like practicing the conversations that you're going to have with your clientele. Valerie, I don't know if you realized you were doing it, but that was basically a script practice session for you, because you weren't just saying, oh, Melanie, in our group, we talked about this. You were speaking to the entire room here as if we were your client, which is going to serve you the next time you need to speak to a client about that. So I know that's not like super on topic with today, like script practice and stuff, but like call it out when you see something good.
Thank you.
I love that.
All right, so let's talk about a couple pieces in there. So we talked about the inspection, right? So Valerie told her client to get ready for the inspection and to contact a home inspector, right? She also mentioned to let the seller know when all of this is happening. Super important point, right? So I'll just add a couple of things in there. When you're scheduling home inspection, can you just pick a date and just show up? No, right? So what do you have to do in order to make sure that the inspection date that the inspector chooses works?
Well, you have to be in communication with your listing agent and see if the house is available at that time.
You got it, right? Who's the most important person that should be at the home inspection?
The buyer.
The buyer, right? Some people actually don't realize that. Okay, so not to be super obvious, but you need to make sure that your client, your buyer, understands that they need to be present for the home inspection. Okay. I've had a couple of situations where buyers will tell the agent, oh, it's fine, I trust you, you can go. No. That can be very dangerous because why? Why do you think that might be dangerous?
Because if something goes wrong, you are liable for what you tell them.
You got it. Liability, huge, right? You don't know what your client is concerned about, right? And there's this funny joke. It's not a joke. Buyers are liars, right? It's not because they're dishonest. It's because they don't know any better, right? So a buyer might tell you, oh, I'm not worried about anything. It's fine. Or, they might say, oh, I don't really care about X, Y, and Z. Then they go to the home inspection and something comes up and all of a sudden it's this huge, like mold, right? Oh, it's fine. I'm not worried about mold. But then they go to home inspection and there's a mold guy there and he tells them that there might be mold, right? And now all of a sudden your buyer is freaking out. Now, we as real estate agents, we deal with mold all the time. We're not necessarily concerned about it in every circumstance. So we may go to home inspection on behalf of a client, think nothing of some of this stuff, and come to find out it's things that your client actually really cares about or is concerned with. And we may have made it seem like no big deal when it actually was a big deal, right? So super obvious, but make sure that your buyer knows that they should be present at the home inspection. And how long do they normally take?
It takes, depending on how big the house is, but it takes between 1 and 2 hours.
Sometimes if you're doing a multifamily, it could be 3 hours, right? So I usually tell my clients, listen, when we schedule the home inspection, now they can schedule it themselves. Sometimes our buyers want us to schedule it for them. It's fine. We have to make sure that they can actually go during the time that it's scheduled for. So check their work schedule or kid schedule, family schedule, whatever, to make sure that it actually is a time that works, right? And like Roland said, just because it works for the buyer and the home inspector doesn't mean it works for the listing agent or the seller. So you need to make sure that it works with them before you just confirm it and start setting up for people to show up there, okay? All right, awesome. Anybody want to add to that first inspection part? Did anybody have anything sort of before that?
I just have a quick question.
Yep.
After the inspection, is there paperwork that's filled out that's sent to the listing agent that says we accept it or not, or is it all just verbal or email communication?
Awesome question. So I think it depends on the state. Typically in Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, we don't have to send a form or a formal document that says we have accepted it. It's typically if there's an issue, then we have to send, and again, it depends on state what the form is, but we have to send some type of written request or document repair request, repair addendum, or amendment for credit. You have to send that within that 10-day inspection period. And that sort of validates that you've requested this information within the contingency that you had for inspection. I don't know what that is for New Hampshire, but just we only have a document if there is a request of something to happen as a result of the inspection. All right,
Yeah,
awesome. So go ahead.
Here in California, the only thing that we have to do is if we see something that needs to be fixed, negotiate, are they gonna fix it or is the buyer is gonna fix it? And then, just write an addendum, to fix it or to give you credit, either one.
Yeah, great point. So formally the document goes out, but when we're talking about where are the points where we have to interact and communicate, when I know that we've left a home inspection, and by the way, just for processes wise, the way that I do it is we go to the home inspection and then I tell the listing agent, thank you so much. My clients are going to go back. Once they get the report, they'll go back through it together tonight just to kind of, look at it again. And then I'll get back to you after they review the report. That just allows me to give my buyers time to think, right? Because it's positive or negative, the way that they feel at the home inspection isn't always necessarily the way they feel later that night or the following morning, right? So just in this process, give yourself a day, right? To just allow the buyer to sit a minute with what happened at the home inspection, look over the report, maybe call people in their family or friends, or in the instance of they said there was an electric concern, maybe we want to talk to the agent about having an electrician come in, right? So you definitely should give your buyer some time to digest it. And then once you figure out what they're looking for, then yes, you want to try to have a conversation to negotiate some of that with the agent. It depends on the situation. You may send the documentation and then call and explain. Typically, I have found that I get a better response if I call the agent first, kind of talk about what happened, what their concerns are, see where their seller might be flexible or not flexible. So I try to have a conversation with the listing agent first, just to kind of get an idea of the response. And then I'll send the document. Sometimes I go, I don't know what they're going to want to do. Just send it to me and I'll send it. Other times they'll be, they know that they're definitely not going to agree to that. I'll go back, talk to my buyer with the feedback I got from the listing agent and say, it's ultimately up to the seller, but here's the feedback from the listing agent that we might want to consider before we put in our requests, right? So Roland's right. You should have a conversation first with the other side to sort of get an idea and negotiate what those repairs or credits should be, and then go back and create the documentation. Anybody else want to share or add anything in there that they do or think you could do? All right. Does anybody want to jump in and share their group's timeline? I think there were 4 or 5 groups.
I think Valerie did a great job explaining transaction in such a small time. I think she did a wonderful job. There's little things here that different states might have to do in addition to what she explained, but I think she did a wonderful job.
Yay! Kudos again to Valerie.
Thank you, Roland.
All right, so then we talked about, so we kind of covered the post inspection. Okay, so we figured out that once the inspection is done, then we're going to either let the agent know that there's no concerns or that there are things that the client would like to have addressed. So if you're going to ask for repairs and you need to have documentation specifically for repairs, how do you guys handle documentation? Like, how do you get things signed and all that?
DocuSign?
DocuSign? Does anybody use anything else?
I had a buyer's agent using .loop. I had to download it from .loop and then upload it to DocuSign.
Yep. So you got some e-signature options. You could do the old-fashioned meet up with them and sign it on paper. Some of the older folks or less technically savvy would like to just physically do things in person. Yep. So who does that repair request go to? Or if it's a concession credit request, who does that go to?
Listing agent.
You got it. Yep. Does it go to anybody else?
the admin of your market center?
Yep, once it's been signed, yep. So, part of this is to make sure that we understand who needs to get what documentation. So, there's kind of this thought, we'll say that there's a kind of two different thoughts on how to handle repair requests. So once it's been agreed upon and everybody signs it, in most cases, it probably states on that document that it's an amendment or addendum, right? So what does that actually mean? How does that affect the process or the transaction? Does anybody know?
Addendum is a addition to whatever the contract was. You do an
Yes.
addendum to the contract. And it could be rejected or it could be accepted.
You got it. So
And when
it
is-
changes the purchase and sales agreement, essentially, right? So who cares about the purchase and sales agreement? Name the parties that are involved and care about that purchase and sales agreement.
The buyer, the seller, and I forgot, the attorney needs to be involved.
Attorney,
And
right.
at what point is the attorney involved in the state of Massachusetts? I'm licensed there as well. I just,
Yeah, so I'll cover that in just a second.
okay.
So when you're modifying or adding to changing a purchase and sales agreement, typically the attorneys, the buyer, the seller, and usually the lender are going to be involved and want to be made aware of any changes to the contract, right? So one of the things to keep in mind is that only applies specifically to the lender if that change affects financing. Okay, so if your client goes through inspections and they're asking for a credit, that changes the finances. If they go through the transaction and they're asking for a reduction in the price, that changes the financing. So those things should go to the lender. A lot of times, the lender does not want to see a repair addendum for things that the seller will physically be doing to the house. Okay, so just keep that in the back of your mind. It's not being dishonest, it's not, but a repair addendum does not affect the value or the financing for the lender, so they don't need the repair request. And if you send them one or you send them an inspection report, they are probably going to call you and say, don't ever do that again. Okay, because any documentation that you give to the lender goes back through the underwriter. And if you look at a purchase and sales agreement, just as an example, there's typically a section that outlines different documents or amendments or things that the seller or buyer have signed. So you'll see a section about lead paint disclosure, a sales disclosure, mandatory relationship disclosure. It kind of says, have you signed or seen these documents? And the buyer will check off, yes, I have. Whatever documents are referenced in that purchase and sales agreement, the lender is going to need and want to see them, right? Whatever you send to the loan processor eventually gets back up to the underwriter, and the underwriter has to validate anything that is in the contract, which means they need to validate any repairs in a repair addendum given to the lender. So if your buyer asks for 5 things to be done and your lender gets a copy of the repair request, technically the lender has to verify that all 5 of those things have been done, and that will hold up your contract unnecessarily because it doesn't affect the financing.
In my case, we use escrow companies. So escrow companies, they make sure that everything in the contract is met. So I noticed that you guys maybe not use escrow.
Yeah, so depending on which state you're in, so to go back and answer Valerie's question, and this kind of ties in, excuse me, Rhode Island is not an attorney state, so we don't have to use an attorney. We can use a title company to do everything. And in that case, it's fine to send the title company the repair addendum because they technically want to make sure that that stuff is done. The lender doesn't need it. In Massachusetts, it's an attorney state, so the attorney typically has to write the purchase and sales agreement. They at least have to review it. And the attorneys do want to see that repair addendum because they're going to make sure that it's done. Dave, I'm going to have you take over because I have to cough.
Oh boy, good thing I was paying attention. Yeah, so with these repair addendums, it's just, I try not to do story time too much, but I'm gonna do story time, and I'm gonna expose, you know, a mistake that I've made in my career, right? Where we've negotiated, you know, between myself and the other agent and the buyer and the seller, we've negotiated, let's just call it $1,000 closing cost credit in lieu of a repair, so that something can be done to the satisfaction of all parties. Well, early in my career, I failed to get that information to the other parties that need that information. In this case, because it was a financial credit, the lender needed to see it, and the attorney needed to see it as well. And because that information, we failed to share that information, none of it made it into the early closing disclosure. So everybody was kind of like, what the heck is this? And there's $1,000 floating out there that the buyer is expecting to get as a credit, and it wasn't happening. So in that example, it was my mistake. So I ate it. I actually gave up $1,000 to my commission to cover that mistake, right? And the lesson there, the very expensive lesson that I learned, is who to communicate these changes to. Any change to a contract needs to be, you know, like every party in the transaction needs to be made aware of that change. So with my lenders, and if it's anything financial, the lenders got to see it. They don't need to know why it's there, but they needed to see it, and the attorneys need to be aware that that is happening. Because if they don't know, then it doesn't get where it needs to be, and then you're scrambling a couple days before closing.
Yeah, and something that Dave put in the chat too. So continuing on with what documentation to who and when. So when you're putting in a repair request, it's typically best for your buyer that you reference the specific pages of the inspection report that your client is looking to have remedied, right? So let's say there's a leak in the roof. If you just put in the repair addendum, seller to fix leak in roof, the seller can determine where he thinks this leak is and fix it wherever he thinks it is, in whichever spot, in whatever manner he so chooses. But if you reference and say seller to repair leak in roof as referenced on page XYZ of inspection report using a licensed roofing company, then there is no room for misunderstanding on what the buyer's expectations are. So I will actually attach the pages of the inspection report to the repair addendum. And to further his point, I do not send the entire inspection report, right? Because the listing agent, one, doesn't need it. And two, if you send them the entire thing, now they technically have to disclose, and you might think that you're doing someone a favor, like, oh, well, I'm going to tell him everything, so he has to fix it or he can't sell the house again. That's not fair. Like, that's not the right thing to do by your buyer. For your buyer, you just want to get the things done that they want done. So just send those pages to the agent that reference exactly where and what the issue is, and be specific on how you want it to be remedied and by who you want it done. We don't want the seller pretending he's a roofer and going up and getting a piece of tarp and nailing it into the roof and saying, oh, I fixed the leak. Technically, if you just say seller to fix the leak, he could do that because you didn't specify exactly what you wanted done. So when you send over a repair addendum, be very specific about what you want done and reference it in the actual inspection report.
This is part of bulletproofing a transaction and knowing where your potential potholes are. And again, I just joked about how I don't want to do story time, but I can share an example where actually I was on the listing side of this and I wound up saving my client a lot of money and ultimately saved a transaction where it's a very long story short. The buyer does their inspection, everything works fine, heating, AC, blah, blah, blah. It's all great, right? I get the repair addendum the buyer, and all it says is replace heating system, and I'm very confused. Why do I need to replace this heating system that works? First of all, you say replace heating system. I would say to you, with what? You know, like, do you like, and who is to do that? I mean, do you want me to just put in a fireplace? Like, do you want me to have a new company come in and put, you know, like, I can interpret that in any number of ways that I wanted. But I knew that was going to be an opportunity for my deal to fall apart. So I called the buyer's agent and I was like, can you give me a little clarity as to why you're requesting this so I can communicate this more effectively to my seller? What it broke down to was her buyer has some pretty severe pet allergies and my seller had some huge dogs. So the concern was that they have, you know, in the HVAC, in the ductwork, that there's going to be a lot of pet hair and dander and stuff like that. So she was going to have allergic reactions. And I said, well, maybe we can just get it cleaned instead of replacing the entire system, because that seems a little, you know, beyond the pale. And that's exactly what we did. So we turned an $8,000 request into a $300 solution and kept the deal going. And that stressor didn't have to exist in the deal if the buyer's agent had understood what they should be communicating and how they wanted stuff, you know, taken care of for their buyers, so that we could all go forward, so that we could turn this into a win-win deal for all parties. So that effective communication, it's really important to be specific in your repair requests so that you make sure that your buyer, we're talking about buyers now, that your buyer gets what they want. Melanie's example is hammering a tarp to the roof to prevent the leak. Imagine rolling up to your walkthrough the morning of the closing, and this buyer is expecting to see their very dry house with a nicely repaired roof, and it's a rainy day, and there's this wet tarp on the roof. Is your buyer going to be happy about that or not? They're going to be really, really upset, not just about the deal and what's happening, but at you for not properly communicating their desires. So these are opportunities for you to bulletproof your transactions.
So once you get through the inspection process, what's the natural next step that happens? We did the inspections, we negotiated any repairs or credits. What's kind of the next step, big step that you guys think happened in the transaction on the buy side?
Make sure you got all the disclosures that you have to disclose.
Yeah, that's a super good point to add into your timeline, guys, right? So depending on the state you're in and the age of the house will determine which specific documents you need to have. But most states require a sales disclosure. I know Massachusetts doesn't require it. Some agents will still use it. That's a sales disclosure or seller's disclosure. It's basically like that checklist of information about the house, okay? That needs to be signed by both parties, the buyer and the seller. You have a lead paint disclosure. I know that it's any house built after 1978. I know in Rhode Island, everybody's just used to having one. So even if the house is newer, people ask you to sign it. There's no harm in signing it, even if the house is newer. You don't technically have to, but our OP has this great line that I love. You are either a facilitator or a complicator. So do you have to sign a lead paint disclosure on a house built in 2010? No. Is it worth you fighting about it or just having your client sign it? Just have your client sign it. There's no harm in it. It takes more energy to say no and go back and forth than it does to just have them sign it, okay? So that's really important, is to have all your disclosures in place, right? You want to do that at the beginning of the transaction. You definitely want to make sure after you've gotten to a big milestone, like getting through inspections, like that's a big milestone. So once you get through that, then you want to go back and make sure you have these disclosures. If you are representing someone in your family, or if you are the buyer, then you probably have a disclosure of personal interest or family relationship. Okay. Massachusetts, I don't think has that. Rhode Island does. Connecticut, I'm not entirely sure, actually, if you do or not. But I know in Rhode Island it is required. In Massachusetts, it's not. So that's a form that you have to fill out if you personally have an interest in the property, or if you are a family member of the person that has an interest in the property. Okay. What other disclosure you think we're supposed to have?
I use, for disclosure purposes, and I use command, which makes it easier to put, if you actually go into the command and it says, paper required, and it normally gives you a list of things that you need to do. So it makes it easier just to follow that list
Yeah.
and upload them as, as they come.
Yeah, so I know that Rhode Island and Mass and Connecticut have a mandatory relationship disclosure, right? So if you are representing the buyer, not just your buyer representation agreement, but you also need a mandatory relationship disclosure that discloses you are representing them as a buyer's agent. You need to have that signed as well. Okay. What's the next step? Oh yeah, Connecticut has the concrete disclosure. So the next sort of big step that I can think of in my mind, and again, guys, jump in here, is the appraisal, right? So that's the next thing on your timeline is the appraisal. Who is responsible for the appraisal and who attends the appraisal?
The agent should be present on the appraisal, and the buyer is responsible for the appraisal.
Yep, so the buyer pays for the appraisal. The lender actually orders it, okay? But the buyer pays for it typically. Now, again, there's always exceptions to every rule. Sometimes the lender might be paying for it, or they might be part of some special program where they don't have to pay for the appraisal. But typically speaking, it's the buyer paying the lender for the appraisal, and the lender hires an appraisal company that assigns an appraiser to go out to the property. Okay, the buyer does not attend. And typically it's just the listing agent that's meeting the appraiser at the house. Okay, so the buyer and the buyer's agent do not attend the appraisal. They just pay for it.
Can I
Does
share
anybody-
wisdom?
Go
Sorry.
ahead.
I wanted to just share a point. I wanted to bring this earlier, but just didn't have a real opportunity to do it. We talked about when to order the appraisal, and Melanie, I'm glad that we're talking about this in the context of the timeline that's happening after inspection. Guys, so Melanie was just talking about how the buyers pay for their appraisal. And I mean, depending on your area, depending on the type of property, you could be talking about anything between like $500 or $600 and $1,000 or more for this thing that comes out of the buyer's pocket, right? If that deal falls apart at any juncture, do they get that money back? No, they do not. That is a sunk cost, right? So if your appraisals are getting ordered like immediately, like, hey, this is great news, we've got our offer accepted. And the next day the lender orders that appraisal, and say that appraisal happens on day 4 or 5 or 6 of that contract. And then your inspection occurs on day 7. And oh no, it's a total disaster. The house is on fire. And it's covered in mold. And there's no way we can move forward. That buyer, that cost for that appraisal, the buyer's eating that cost. So commonplace in our area is that we actually wait, and it's not a mandate, but it's just good service in my opinion. Commonplace in our area is to wait until you are through the inspection period to communicate to the lender that you want to get that ordered. Now you might have it ordered a little bit ahead of time, just kind of be like, hey, we have an inspection issue, so let's not actually send the appraiser out there. But it is something that you should be monitoring. So we were talking about whiteboards and putting things on calendars and how you manage all of these important occurrences throughout a transaction. This is one really specific juggling act you want to do, because it's going to save your buyer what is a pretty significant amount of money for them.
And I think you probably in earlier sessions covered, like, when you have a new buyer, you should have, if not a relationship, a conversation with the lender, right? And so this is one of those questions that you can have as part of sort of getting to know the lender that your buyer is using, because some lenders will order the appraisal and the client gets charged for it, but they don't actually pay for it until the appraisal is done, right? So there might be an exception where they can order it, but if the appraiser doesn't actually go out, then they get that money back. So just have a conversation with the lender to understand, when does that appraisal actually get ordered? When do they pay for it? Like, understand how that operates, because there might be cases where you do need to have that appraisal like on board, ready to go, scheduled, but you don't want your client to pay for it until they actually need to. Super good point. Okay, so let's talk about what happens at the appraisal, because we want to, again, we want a timeline of who do I talk to and when, and what do they need to do, what actions need to happen, okay? So what are the outcomes of an appraisal? What could happen at an appraisal?
That your property does not appraise for the asking price or the contract price.
Yep, so it could not appraise. What else? Somebody else want to share? What else could happen at an appraisal?
May not meet the requirements for the loan that is required.
Yep, it might not qualify, right? So if you have an FHA or a VA or a USDA loan, that appraisal isn't just about verifying the value. It also is making sure that the home physically qualifies for that type of loan. Super good point. So it may not appraise, it may not physically qualify for that type of financing, or it could go great and the price comes in and the condition's great and no concerns, right? Dave brought up there's unpermitted work. So a lot of times if you're using certain loans, government-backed loans, there's additional physical requirements. And if it didn't have permits or there's issues, safety issues, it may not qualify, okay? So let's kind of start with worst case scenario and work our way up to a happy ending, okay? So worst case scenario, it either doesn't physically, if it doesn't physically meet the requirements of that type of mortgage, what do you think you guys are supposed to do, or who do you talk to?
Talk to the lender and see if they can get into a different program so they don't
Yep,
lose the deal.
Yep, that is one option. Yep. If it's a smaller fix, so I'll just use FHA, and we're not going to get into every loan and what are the requirements of every loan, but let's just use an example. So let's say that your buyer is using an FHA loan and there's chipping paint on the outside of the house, right? The appraiser goes out, he says the value is great. Yeah, it's worth $345, but there's chipping paint outside and that has to be remedied in order for it to appraise. So just keep in mind, guys, appraise doesn't always just mean a number. Appraise just means it meets the requirements of the appraisal of that property, okay? So let's say, oh, the value's fine. It just doesn't physically meet the requirement. There's chipping paint outside, okay? You can either, as a seller, the seller can either say, so sorry, too bad. I'm not fixing it, so you're out of luck. Most times the seller, if it's not a big requirement, it doesn't take a lot of time or a lot of money, they're probably going to remedy the issue, right? So if there's chipping paint, the seller is likely going to scrape and repaint the areas that have to be taken care of. In that case, the appraisal company has to go back out to the property. In most cases, the buyer, you guys are representing the buyer, so this is something in your sort of timeline and communication. If the appraiser has to go back out again, your buyer probably has to pay another appraisal fee. It's not normally the full price. It's usually some discounted amount, but typically if the appraiser has to go out and physically visit the property again, your buyer probably has to pay something, okay? The appraiser will go back out and verify that whatever he said needed to be fixed. And similar situation when it comes to what documents and who, typically the appraisal, the report is going to have point out the areas that need to be addressed. The buyer's agent will want to provide just that section. Don't tell them about the value or don't send them the whole report. Just send them the pictures of that area with the information about what needs to be fixed and send that to the seller. Dave, I got to pass it to you again. I'm sorry.
Mel and I were talking about 7:30 this morning, and she was discussing how she has a cold and a sore throat and is going to have a hard time talking. I said, "Oh, cool, me too." So this ought to be a good time. So honestly, like that whole thing about the appraiser having to go back out. Remember the point that I was just making about the buyer having to pay for the appraiser to go out? If you, as a representative of a buyer with FHA financing being our example, and you recognize that there are some conditions that exist in the house that you would expect an FHA appraiser to call out and have remedied. In our area, we always talk about chipping paint, as Melanie was discussing, or like a missing handrail on a stair. As the representative of the buyer, I might point that out to the listing agent and be like, listen, the stairway to the basement doesn't have a handrail. And I really don't want my buyer to have to pay for a, what do they call it? A revisitation fee, I think. That can be a couple $100 for that appraiser. So understand those little instances where you can save your buyer some money and get rave reviews later, which we're going to talk about shortly. Okay, so for our timeline purposes, remember we're on our buyer timeline. So in our example here, we are through. Now we're through appraisal. Unless anybody has any questions, I don't want to move past this too quickly. Are we all straight on how the appraisal process works and where we are on our timeline? Okay. So great, good job, guys. Your buyer's offer that you submit on their behalf, you've gotten through the inspection for the property that they love, and you must have done a good job on the value because it's come back at exactly what they're, what they were offering to pay. Good job. What's next? What's the next thing in our timeline that we need to coordinate? One of those big deadlines, not the inspection, but rhymes with mortgage. Somebody's got me. All right, the mortgage, guys, the mortgage contingency, right? So the mortgage, very, very funny day. Very good. So that mortgage contingency. So, okay, the appraiser's back. It doesn't necessarily mean that we've gotten our mortgage commitment. It could be one of the last, if not the last conditions to get that mortgage commitment, but it's not necessarily the end of the process. So at this point, like if you've gotten all this stuff, all this information back by this point, it makes sense to communicate with your lender like, hey, our mortgage commitment deadline is in a couple of days. How are we looking? Might be worth having that conversation, right? And that's when you might learn like, hey, there's going to be, there's this condition that has to be satisfied, and sometimes those conditions can be quick. Sometimes they can be complicated. It could be just a BOE, like a verification of employment, which might mean just a letter from the employer that says, oh yeah, this person still works here. We're still paying this person. Or it could be something more complicated, where we actually learned that we had to get some kind of water quality write-off like 2 days before mortgage commitment. I had never gone through that before. That was just the summer. So it's worth communicating with your lender about any outstanding conditions that might come up through the mortgage contingency, right? One of the things I say in my coaching experience a lot is we like to stay in our lane. Okay, like I'm the realtor, so I'm gonna comment on realtor related tasks. I don't want to get too deep in what the lender's job is, but the lender at this point in the transaction is your best friend, and they should be communicating anything that they need from the buyer. Now, ideally, we have relationships with these lenders. I always say that the relationship you have with your lender is the most important relationship you have in this business. So ideally, you have a relationship with this person and you know how to close deals, but we're at Ignite, guys. So some of us are, are looking for our first deal. We've done 1 or 2 deals. We don't really have a lot of, extensive relationships with these people. So we don't know how they work. So in terms of managing the transaction and avoiding risk and making sure we get from contract to close, it's worth having that conversation and making sure that the lender knows what they're doing, right? Like, do you think that there are professionals in our industry, in any aspect of the industry? Like, do you think it's 100% competency rate? Oh boy, oh boy, if you do, I applaud you for your sunny optimism, but there are people out there who might be complicators, as Melanie was saying earlier. So I want to make sure that I'm asking questions about that, okay? So Melanie, you can take over anytime, or I can just kind of keep blasting through here.
I can jump in.
Wonderful,
So we've gotten through appraisals, we've gotten through mortgage contingency. Can anybody think of anything else that we need to address, or steps that we need to think about, communication that we might need to send out?
When do you coordinate the fire department for the smokes? At what point?
Awesome. So it will depend again, depending on state and all of that. And most importantly, it depends on the city or town where the listing is, right? For you on the buy side, you don't coordinate anything. Okay. And we are going to do this whole exercise on the list side. It'll be a lot faster, right? Because we've gotten through a lot of this. But on the buy side, you don't do anything with the smoke inspection. Okay. So for the buy side, you don't have to worry about that, other than as a buyer's agent, you probably want to check in with the listing agent and make sure that it's been done or that it's been scheduled. So date wise on your timeline, I personally, if I'm the buyer's agent, I do that 2 weeks before closing. I'll ask the listing agent if they've scheduled the smoke inspection. Awesome addition.
For those of you licensed in Connecticut, it is not a requirement in Connecticut, but in Massachusetts and Rhode Island is. I think it's actually only required in 7 states. I learned that recently. But it's a good point to bring up. On the listing side, by the way, when I'm on the listing side, I know we're not doing listing yet. On the listing side, I do it right away. I schedule it immediately because I don't want to forget. I don't want to get 3 days before closing and realize that I don't have it yet. And this particular town only does them on Wednesdays. And we might need to delay that. And that's a real thing in Rhode Island, like North Providence, Rhode Island, they only do them on Wednesdays. I don't want to delay a closing because I forgot something. So in part of my process list, that's something that I have there. I schedule it right away. Know thyself, as Plato said.
Dave said, make sure transfer of utilities. Yes. So on the buy side, there is no requirement on behalf of the agent, but it is good service, I think, for you to provide your buyer with who the utility companies are and or the options that they might have. You know, some towns might provide either Comcast or Verizon. Let them know what their options are. If there isn't an option, tell them who the companies are that they use for utilities. Find out when trash day is, right? Ask the listing agent when trash day is. I would give that to my buyer. I typically do that because we're at the end of the timeline. So now that I know the appraisal happened, the inspection happened, we're definitely moving forward. I usually give them that information like a few days beforehand. I don't give it to them too early because I've had more than one client who would like cancel their internet and then something happens and we have to extend the contract. So I don't give it to them too early. I usually give it to them a few days beforehand. And I tell them to call the utilities and let them know to transfer on closing date. You can't transfer beforehand, so don't try to take care of it early. They can call them, but they need to let them know that it's getting transferred on a specific date. Go ahead, Dave. I see you in the chat.
Oh no, I was responding. So Valerie had a great had a great addition. This would be more for the seller side, but she asked about prorating the oil that's in a tank.
Yeah, so on the buy side, you're not responsible for that. We'll talk about that when we get on the sell side. You're going to want to make sure that there's certain other little checks that you have to do as well.
Right.
I've never had a buyer, can you tell? Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I wish
Don't
we all
apologize at
could
all.
say that.
Yeah, you have some fantastic additions, and there's no such thing as a stupid question. Ask all of your questions. That's why we're here, guys. We're here for you to learn and for you guys to have 100% competency within your industry.
All right, so we get through the rest of that. Now we're sort of sailing, right? Like we're ready to get to closing. So kind of the last 2 big steps are your walkthrough. So typically myself, I like to do it the morning of. Some people do it the day before. I've just had too many instances where I go the day before and then the morning of there's a problem. So I just err on the side of extreme caution. And I try to do the walkthroughs the morning of closing. So if I'm closing at 9, I'm going to walk through at 8. That's just myself. Other people, you know, it's completely up to you guys. If you have a different process, please share. Would love to hear it. I usually do it the morning of. And I always tell my clients, so when you're thinking about when do I communicate stuff, I let them know about the walkthrough process early on because I've had clients who are always nervous. And I don't know if you guys have ever had this with a buyer. They're like, I just know that the seller is not going to get their stuff out. So can we do the walkthrough like 2 weeks ahead of time to make sure they got all their stuff out? No, because the seller is allowed to live there until 9 o'clock a.m. on closing day. So no, we can't go 2 weeks ahead of time to make sure that they've actually moved all their stuff out, right? So I do my walkthrough the morning of, about an hour, and I tell them my communication, my how I share this with my clients is the walkthrough's quick. Okay, the walkthrough is going to take about 10 or 15 minutes. It's just for us to make sure that the pipes didn't burst, that the house didn't catch on fire. If there were repairs that were supposed to be done, by the way, if there are repairs supposed to be done, I'm confirming that way in advance. I'm not waiting until walkthrough to confirm that the repairs were done. Okay. Unfortunately, a lot of times they're not. So you don't want to wait until the day of closing to find out that the repairs they were supposed to do have been done. So we didn't cover this, so I'm glad I'm remembering it. In some of the repair addendums or repair requests, there's actually a space that says the seller has X amount of time to get those repairs done. Okay. If your contract doesn't have that in a section, feel free to ask for it in additional provisions, right? The worst thing they can say is, no, I'm not going to get it done early. Most times they're going to be fine with getting it done before closing, but I'm always going to ask that those repairs are done in advance so that I can have time to go back to the house and verify, review, physically see for myself that those repairs have been taken care of. Okay, so we're not waiting until the morning of to do that. Now, if the seller is a stickler and they just will not agree to taking care of them earlier, sometimes you can't avoid that situation. So I do understand that sometimes you have to wait until walkthrough. If you have an option, try to get it done ahead of time. Okay, so we go to the walkthrough, and then the last step is the actual closing. So when it comes to communication, who am I talking to and when? You want to make sure that the seller understands that they have to be out by X time at the time of walkthrough. That means that they need to have all of their belongings out and need to be physically gone from the house at the time of the walkthrough. So I'm going to call the listing agent probably the day before and just say, hey, just checking in, want to make sure that the sellers have been able to get everything out and we're all set for walkthrough in the morning, right? So I'm going to call the listing agent. That's some communication to make sure that they've taken care of everything that they're going to take care of. Okay. You don't want to wait and just assume that everything's going to be fine, right? Okay. So we get to walkthrough. Now it's closing day. So it's up to you on who attends the closing, like if you attend or not. There's no like rule or law about how that works. Things are very different now because of COVID. Closings have changed a lot. So typically, timeline wise, what I have found is the sellers are signing paperwork with their own attorney, and they're usually doing that the day or the night before. And then that attorney is overnight courier dropping off those signed documents from the seller to the buyer's attorney. And the buyer's attorney is sometimes called the closing attorney. That's the buyer's attorney, okay? Depending on what state you're in and whatever, sometimes that attorney may not necessarily have been hired by the buyer. They may have been the attorney for the lender. So just something to keep in mind in some states. The buyer and or closing attorney will get the paperwork from the seller's attorney, and then your buyer will sit down with the closing attorney and sign paperwork after the walkthrough. Okay, so just sort of process and timeline wise. Is there anything that you guys think we missed on the buy side? And we are going to take a 5-minute break, and then we're going to come back. We're going to do the seller side and then finish up with a couple of other risk avoidance topics, and then we'll let you guys out. Anything we missed on the buy side? All right, so let's take 5, quick little break. We'll be back here at 11:15 exactly, and we'll pick up on the sell side. We are at 11:15.
We're back, baby.
We'll give a second for people to get back on. We're going to talk about the seller side of our timeline.
Before we move on to a new topic, Melanie, I wonder if it would make sense for us to search the group for some ahas. That's one of my favorite parts of Coaching Ignite.
Sure.
Not sure if this is an aha, but certainly a question. So all of us newer people, whatever that means, 30, 60, 90 days, something. For me, it's overwhelming. It's like, wow. I've got my wife, luckily, for 8 years. How long did it take any one of you to get to the point where you're like, I've got this. Maybe I have this checklist I still need to refer to, but I'm finally feeling comfortable that I'm going to include everything and do the right thing, liability-wise, service-wise for my customer, client.
Let you know when I get there. Honestly, so Melanie and I, we not only are both coaches in our office, but we work very closely together. We have a lot of similar work ethics, and we're also good friends. So, and our careers have taken pretty parallel paths, wouldn't you say, Mel? Where we spent several years being what Melanie refers to as secret agents before our businesses really took off. We both have been in the business for about 10 years, independently. It's all very coincidentally parallel. But it was years before I felt comfortable. And I really got committed to being full-time in real estate after what I think was about 6, 7, 8 years. So we're talking about like 2019. And the more I learned is the more now I've capped every year since then, and I've become a coach and, you know, top producer in the office, and I can put this lovely sign in my yard, about top 20% of the agents, all that stuff. But even with that, even with success and experience, the more I learn, the more I know, the more I realize I don't know. And remember that one of the 6 personal perspectives is always to be learning based. So I don't know that I'll ever say that I feel like I know everything. And I know that's not how you phrase the question, but I don't know that I'm ever going to say that. I don't know that I'm ever going to feel that. And even if I did feel that, I'd say, okay, what do I need to go learn now? Like, this is like one of the great things about this industry is the opportunity to continue expanding your learning base. So that's my very long-winded answer. The shorter answer that I could give is that, you know, honestly, it wasn't until I had done like a dozen transactions on a buy side and a sell side where I was like, okay, I at least am confident I'm not going to forget the smoke shirt this time. Like, or at least I know that I need to send the addendum on a credit to the lender now. Like that, it always takes deals. You learn by doing in this industry, and it can take a while. Just like take notes and take your lumps as you go, and you'll get there.
I'll just add in, I would challenge you to never get comfortable.
Right.
Okay.
Love that.
Don't allow yourself to get comfortable. One, because that forces us to constantly have humility, right? And two, it's like going E to P, right? We talk about going from entrepreneurial to purposeful, and then you hit a ceiling, right? And that ceiling isn't for you to stop. That ceiling is for you to figure out, how do I break through to get to the next ceiling, right? So never get comfortable. Always feel like you have an opportunity to learn and to grow and to be humbled. I'll also say things change constantly. The documents change, the rules change, the liabilities change, the expectations change, the market changes. So one of the parts of our job as a real estate agent is to have systems, right? Like when we talk about leverage, and MREA talks about, you know, the keys to all of the people in this book had systems, right? They're not relying on themselves to remember what these timelines are, right? They have a system in place, a checklist. I still use checklists and I'm constantly updating it. Now I use it in command. So it tells me exactly what to do because I don't want to rely on myself to remember. And we're all going to get so busy either with transactions or life or whatever it is that we're going to forget things. Even if we think we're the best real estate agent, we're going to forget things. And so don't rely on yourself to feel like you're good enough to, I got this now. Never feel that way. You got it. Okay. You just have a system to back you up and support you to make sure that you got it is automated and somebody or something is reminding you of what all these steps are. Okay. Don't just rely on yourself to do enough deals to know, now I know what all the steps are. Every really successful MREA has systems and tools and people that they're leveraging to help them remember what all these steps are. They're not doing it on their own. Trust me. Even guys that do 200 deals a year are going to forget stuff or miss something. They've got systems and people that are helping them.
Yep.
So
Always
Jason
learning.
asked about sharing the command checklist. So we're going to show you where they are. But I would also challenge you guys, if there's anybody on here familiar with Pivot Shift Ahead, James Shaw. Okay. No one's saying anything. So let's assume you don't.
Yes.
Pivot, the community that James Shaw has created with Pivot, and if you go on, Emily knows, if you go on Facebook and search Pivot, P-I-V-O-T, you'll find a group, Pivot Shift Ahead. It's run by James Shaw. He's part of KW. He started it right before COVID or right when COVID started. It's an amazing community and there is tons and tons and tons and tons of free, valuable information, resources, people in there to give you all kinds of stuff. There's a gentleman named Dan I can never say his name correctly. I think it's Turmerkin. He's nerdy like me, so he creates spreadsheets for everything. He just did a whole workshop with people from that group for free, by the way, where they came up with an entire checklist spreadsheet of every single step in a transaction. So if you go and Pivot Shift Ahead and just do some searching, check out the files section, look up Dan Turmerkin, Tumerkin. Guys, this is a community. This is what KW does. We just share everything. So my checklists are not great, to be perfectly honest, because I'm still building mine. And I started by going to Dan's workshop and using this spreadsheet that Dan and his other agents have created. So go check that out on Pivot and they'll give you some awesome tools in there, including the checklists. Yeah, I mean, and by the way, so he does a daily call Monday through Friday, guys, at 8 a.m. Eastern. If you get on at 7:30, he has it's kind of like our hangout chill time. If you go on that Facebook group I just told you about, you'll see the link and you can register for it. It's a Zoom every morning. Amazing. Mindset and a bunch of MREAs are in there sharing best practices, systems, tools, documents, all kinds of stuff in there. Okay, so check that out. All right. So I'm going to put you guys back into breakout rooms yet again. You're probably going to be with different people this time. And now we're going to focus on the transaction on the sell side. So we've already covered most of it on the buy side. So this shouldn't take too long. I am going to do 5 minutes just because we're getting closer to the end. So this should just be anything that we maybe didn't need on the buy side or things that we kind of forgot on the first round. We can add these in here. And then we'll come back together. And the same tools I want you to use from page 19.5. Melissa, thanks for coming. The questions to ask, the points where I need to communicate, who do I need to communicate with, and what documents do I need to use? That's kind of our focus. So I'm going to put you guys in a room and we're going to do this again on the sell side. Breakout rooms, bear with me. Recreate. There'll be only a couple of you each room now because some people have left. So let me change this to 5 minutes and I'll send you guys off. All right. We are back. And so we're going to share now what you guys came away with when we went in our breakout rooms to talk about the seller timeline. So in essence, time of is the essence for us. So let's just cover stuff that we didn't cover when we went through the buyer side. Are there specific things that we should pull out when you're representing the seller? Anybody? Dave, I saw your hand up a second ago. You still want to talk?
I
Me?
always want to talk, but it's not my field, Melanie. First of all, I want to commend everybody who's still here. Like when we started back at the beginning of September, there were like 54 people almost every single day. And probably 3 of them were like the team, or 4, right? But it's a long-term game and it's overwhelming in the fact that, some of us are busy. I got it. Anyway, so fast forward. I was just speaking with Don, and one of the things we were thinking was you'll need to order the pictures, like those things that take time, just part of the whole marketing thing. But anyway, and what is it? I think it's MREA, right? Gary's saying listings will really give you, right, the leverage to
Listings are our leverage. That's like listen, when you're brand new in real estate, it's natural that you get more buyers than sellers. That's just natural. If you got into the business last year, it's probably the reverse because you could sneeze and get a listing, right? But generally speaking, newer agents tend to get buyers more than sellers in the beginning, but listings are our leverage. So yes, continue to lead generate with buyers, but as you build your business and you have to make choices, especially if you're dual career and you have a whole nother job, you have to be very intentional with how you spend your time. And so we still want you to maintain relationships with buyers, but really try to add some additional intention or focus on the listing side, because that's where all of our leverage is. Super, super, super important point, right? So yeah, you sign your listing agreement, right? We know we got the contract. Then what? You need to schedule the photographs, right? And listen, you're newer agents, you might not have the money to go hire a professional photographer. I totally get it. At least try to find a friend with a decent camera. If you have to use your iPhone, I get it. But if we could at least try to get somebody with a Canon to try to help take pictures, that would be great. So yeah, scheduling the photos. Valerie?
I'm very confused. I thought this was preparing the seller for the closing. The pictures will have already been taken if the offer was accepted.
Oh, so did you guys already cover in the previous sessions getting the listing and doing the pictures?
I don't know, but I thought this was the closing and we were prepping the seller for closing. That's what we talked
Okay.
about.
Nope, that's totally fine. You're
Was I
probably
wrong?
right.
Sorry
No,
about
We've
you're
talked
not.
about staging, photography and things like that before.
Okay, you've done that part. Okay, perfect. All right, good. So Valerie, you're totally right. So now we are under contract as a seller and we're preparing for closing. Yes, thank you. I'm glad you got us back on track. So Valerie, did you want to share some of the things? I mean, everybody I know this is what happens when you're smart. Everybody wants you to talk. Do you want to share? No pressure.
Again, I winged it. I was with Roland, but Roland knew more, so it was good. Hello, Mr. Seller. Great. Now you accepted the offer. Blah blah blah. You need to clean. Get showing ready. Be ready for the open house. Be prepared to leave when showings happen. Coordinate the dog, the family members, everything. Hide all your personal items. Put them away so they're not out. Mr. Seller, I'm going to be in touch with you when we get the inspection. We'll have to look over all of that. Oh, here's one thing though. We didn't talk about this, Roland, but this happened to me. Okay. So I was brand new, didn't know what I was doing, right? Oh, yeah, the inspection's going to come. Well, I didn't tell him what the inspection entailed. And the guy got home and he was so mad that they ran the dishwasher, like little stupid stuff. And who dug a hole in my backyard? Well, that would be the septic people. They had to, find and make sure. So I learned, like, you got to tell them that. Oil proration, that's, whatever's left in the tank is actually now the buyer. So you're going to get a little money back at closing. And that'll happen towards the end. You'll have your oil company come out and give you what it would cost, right? Whether it's oil or propane. Cleaning the septic. Now, I know when I bought my house, part of the contingency was, and my realtor said, you don't want to have to deal with the previous owner's poops. So maybe you want to, have your septic cleaned. Roland brought up a good point. Sometimes sellers don't know where their septic is. They
Mhm.
should do the research and get the septic design so that they can give it to the buyer's agent to help along the process. Because if not, I think the seller, Roland had said, has to pay to get that information to the buyer. If you live in a state, you have to get your smokes, fire department, all that. And the day of closing, you have to give up all your keys, garage door openers, last minute stuff to your listing agent and to be able to hand over to them at closing. That's what I got.
Awesome job. You're hired.
Oh, thanks. I could
Awesome
use the
job.
money.
Yeah. Need the listings. Yeah, so okay, so on the screen they talk about pending in MLS. So when you're thinking about, okay, I'm headed to the closing table, where are all the little pieces and things I have to consider? So MLS is one of them. You should be checking on that buy and sell side. So you want to make sure that once you go under contract that you go in and change the status. Now, every state and every MLS has their own different names of the status. So you want to put it in a status. It's usually pending, which lets prospective other buyers know that you are under contract, you have a buyer. In some states, you can accept backup offers for a certain amount of time. There's different statuses, but essentially you want to change it so that people that are looking at the MLS know that it's no longer available for sale, or that even if I still show it, I do have a contract, a buyer under contract, right? Most times it's going to be pending. So you change that status. Awesome point, Valerie, about talking to your seller about what to expect at the home inspection. I honestly I don't think I've ever thought about that, to the point of they're going to run the dishwasher. Like, that's such a good point. Like, I usually tell my seller, you're not there, you can't be there. They're going to rummage through some stuff and test things, but I don't think I've ever really said, like, they're going to run the dishwasher, they're going to open up the plumb, like, they're going to kind of go through your house. And that's such a good point. I unfortunately did have a situation where the seller, like Dave was saying, wouldn't leave the property. And they were there for the entire inspection. And they felt so violated. And I kind of gave them an idea of what was coming, but they had no idea to what extent a home inspection actually is of their own home. Like, the husband was kind of roaming around outside and he's like, should I? I'm like, nope, you're fine. Just sit down. But it's like calling your kid ugly is how it feels to a seller. So yeah, I think Valerie's super good point is have a conversation, let your seller know what to expect. If they're going to be there, have like a really good conversation, like get ready to feel like they're calling your kid ugly, because that's what it's going to feel like. So I love that part. Does anybody else want to add anything in? No? All right.
I like
Go
I
ahead.
like your child being ugly.
There's one thing, and forgive me if Valerie, if you said it and I just didn't hear it, but on towns or cities that have that are connected to city or town water, one thing you're going to have to provide is a water reading. So it's like, if you guys don't know what that is, it's like where the water comes into the house. It's just this little flangey looking thing, this pipe, and there's I don't know if you can tell how big this is, maybe the size of like a grapefruit, right? It's usually just a black case and they'll have some numbers on it. Sometimes there's a little black lid, but you're going to have to take a picture of that and get that to the to your attorney, so that they can, get any usage paid and all that kind of stuff. The only other thing, this is
Hold
massive.
on, before you move off of that. So on your timeline, guys, that's going to happen probably a week or two before closing.
Right.
The purpose of that is, like he said, it's to get a gauge of what the water is so that they can come up with the final water bill, which needs to go on the CD. So you don't want to wait until the day before. We want to try to get that on the CD ahead of time. If for some reason the town doesn't provide the final bill right away, then they save space for that and let the clients know that this might change by, a few $100s here or there because of the water reading. But timeline wise, you want to do that like 2 weeks before closing. And same thing with the fire inspection. Depending on the town that you're in, you want to order that probably about 2 weeks. We have a couple of cities here where it takes like 3 weeks, so we'll schedule that 3 weeks in advance, but close to the closing date. You don't want to schedule them to come out right away necessarily, but at least call in areas where it takes a little bit longer to have that smoke inspection. Go ahead. What was the other one? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, the other, I mean, very state specific. For those of you who are licensed in Massachusetts, if there is a septic system, you're gonna have to make sure you have what is called a Title V certificate, which is some professional's assessment of the septic system that it is functioning properly. So very specific to Massachusetts. I don't know of any other states that have it, but I know Massachusetts does.
I'm looking on the timeline. Why does it say send seller low appraisal? Oh, if it's low, we need to inform the seller, but if it's fine, they don't need to know, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, so good point. On the sharing side, what documents who has to get what? I forgot to mention this. The buyer pays for the home inspection and the buyer pays for the appraisal. They belong to them. So the buyer does not have to give them to the seller. My sellers always want a copy of those things. I'm like, no, you don't. It doesn't matter. But it's their child, right? This ugly child thing. They feel like they want to know just to know because they want to know. They don't need to know. And I let them know that they don't need to know. If it comes in low, if the appraisal comes in low, then yes, you as the listing agent should request a copy of the appraisal. You're not just going to take their word for it. Anything else we think we've missed? Or anybody wants to share best practices, questions?
Quick question. Can you be so direct and subtle with your client, if you're the listing agent, to say, hey, listen, you don't want that, and here's a reason why. If they discover, like, you can say that, can't you? It's not being deceptive, it's being straight honest. Once you know something, you then have to disclose it, and it's possible that the next buyer might not have an issue with whatever they find in there.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've got to read the room, right? Like if your client is very strong-willed and they want to be in control and they want to make all the decisions, it might be a little bit different conversation than someone that's like, I don't know what I'm doing, so just tell me what to do, right? So you have to kind of recognize the personality type that you're working with, but buyers and sellers want someone that's going to be honest. They might not like the truth, but they do want the truth. They don't always realize it right away, but between your initial conversation with a client and the very end of a transaction, they will recognize somewhere along that line that they do want the truth. They just might not recognize it right away. So yeah, being direct and transparent, that's part of your job, right? I always tell people, listen, I'm going to tell you things that you're not going to like to hear, but I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't tell them to you. Go ahead, Valerie.
Okay, so I meant to ask this and I'm glad I just remembered. Closing gifts. What do we give the buyer and the seller, and do we really have to? What are your thoughts on that?
I don't.
$1 million.
My entire commission. Don't do that, by the way.
So it depends. It depends in my opinion. I don't think it's right or wrong either way. And I don't think that you have to for everyone. I don't think you have to in general. I know that agents that do it have a lot of success in that, right? Like their clients will take pictures of their gift and post it online, but you don't have to do a gift, but you absolutely can. If you're going to do them, I would say that you do something a little bit more meaningful or practical. Because I don't know about you, but if somebody gives me a gift that didn't mean anything, I'm irritated that you gave me a gift, right? Like if you just literally ran by CVS and picked up a free carnation out of the $3 bin and brought it to me at closing because you felt like you had to give me a gift, I would be upset that you did that. I'd rather you not give me a gift, right? So if you're going to do it, I would say make it something either practical or meaningful. And yeah, Dave. Kim, I think Kim, you probably have a different opinion about that.
No, I was just gonna mention, also make sure that you don't always just buy alcohol, because I had an agent a couple months ago get very embarrassed because they brought alcohol, and it turns out that one of the clients was actually a recovering alcoholic. So you want to be careful with stuff like that. Know your client.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I normally give a gift basket. And I normally send it to their job. Because
So smart.
I send it to their jobs, and normally I send food because you're not going to eat the whole basket.
That's
You're
so
gonna
good.
share it. And so they're, who sent you that? Oh, my agent sold it, that kind of thing. And I have pretty good success with that.
I love that. That's such a good idea. Such a good idea. Use it as an opportunity. Now it's marketing, so you could write it off. And it's an opportunity for you to get more business, right? Other than from just your client. Now, I have given gifts. I have given client gifts. It's just not a normal part of my business. And David, my clients love me so much, you couldn't pay them $1 million. Just saying.
That's fine.
So the other thing that we didn't talk about on the buy side or the sell side yet is extension. So Kim brought this up. Great point. I completely didn't even think of it, but things don't always close on time either, right? So setting a couple of expectations is talk to your seller and your buyer about that, right? Let them know when we submit this offer, this is the closing date we're going to ask for, and this is the date that everybody is going to work towards, but we may not close on that specific date. So don't go take a week off today once we sign the purchase and sales agreement, because that closing date could move. It could move a day or two. It could move out further than that. So I typically tell my clients, don't schedule time off until, for me, after the appraisal. Because in my mind, the inspection and the appraisal are the two biggest areas where a deal can fall through. So I'm not going to have my client make any sort of big schedule changes until we're past that point. And if they're going to, they need to at least understand that it's a little fluid and that they have to be flexible in the event that that date changes. Okay.
Yeah, I want to just add to that on the buyer side, not to move money from one account to another. That makes it a big problem.
Yes.
And on the seller side, just to have a little patience.
Yep.
Melanie, there's one other thing that we have forgotten to mention. On the listing or buying side, submitting your commission bill to make sure that your commission gets on the CD. So obviously we don't want you guys working for free. Let's remember that that's part of the list of documents that you're going to need to submit.
Yeah, and you should review them. Don't just take them.
Yes.
Right. I love RMCA, but don't just take the commission bill and send it. Like, actually look at it and make sure that the amounts on there are correct before you submit that to the attorney, because it's not easy to get that stuff changed after the fact. You want to do that beforehand, right? So the next sort of big celebration is our clear to close. Yay! That's when everybody's excited. Typically, and I don't know if this is, you guys see it differently, but typically the attorneys that I work with won't formally schedule, sit down, it's in the book, can't be moved, a closing until they have the clear to close from the lender. Okay. How many days between closing and clear to close do we have to have? Once we get the clear to close, how many days do we have to wait to close? Typically.
Steven's holding up 3 fingers.
You got it. 3 days. So I always tell my client, we'll know for sure that our closing is scheduled and the time 3 days in advance. Okay. We put 10 a.m. on October 1st. That's what everybody's going to work towards, but we won't know that until 3 days before for sure, because most attorneys won't schedule until they have that clear to close.
Also, if you close on Monday, you save your clients interest.
Really? Explain that.
On the weekends, normally most lenders fund on Friday. And so you have Saturday, Sunday, and then normally you take care of the property or whatever, Monday or Tuesday. You'll pay 2 extra days of interest if you close on Friday.
Oh, good point. Oh, why is my screen just moved by itself?
I was an underwriter for 18 years before I did this, so.
Oh, so you know. The other thing too is I don't close on Fridays. I try not to close on Fridays because, and again, this all depends on the state that you live in. Typically here, if we're closing on October 1st, seller has to be out by October 1st, buyer can move in on October 1st. In some states, you don't get to move in right away, okay? So in our state, also, it's typical that the buyer doesn't move in until it's recorded. So if something happens on Friday and we can't close, your client is homeless for a weekend, and I've had it happen. So I typically try to close myself on a Wednesday or Thursday because Mondays are always crazy. Attorneys are a mess. So I typically personally try to close on a Thursday. That way, if anything happens, I still have Friday as a whole nother business day to get it taken care of if there are any issues. Go ahead, David.
One of the attorney sponsors at one of the Bold days we were at suggested that 80% of the business they get is right at that, almost the last week of a month. And also Mondays and Fridays, like you said, are insane. So if
Yeah.
you want to make things smoother, higher likelihood of just, again, overall smoothness, earlier in the month, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, his opinion. for the
Awesome.
best days.
That's good. Yeah, you heard it from the guy that's gonna manage it, so that's good advice. Anything else that we think we forgot?
No, but I shared this the other day, going back to that seller that I had with the dishwasher. It was a horrible first transaction. And he thought that closing date was a willy-nilly date and he might have an extra week to get out. So that was a rude awakening for me. The
Yeah, in some
buyer didn't want to budge. The contract date is the contract date, unless there's stuff like the appraisal or the mortgage. It's not because you're not ready to move. Just
Yeah,
wanted to share that.
no, it's really important. And in some states, they can stay. In some states, the buyer doesn't move in right away. So you've got to be aware of, obviously, the rules in wherever you're operating. And we say this all the time to our agents: consumers don't know how this works. Consumers have no idea how we get paid, what our job is, when things have to be done, what the rules are, what the legal ramifications are of what they're doing. Like, they literally have no idea how this works. So the things that seem common sense, logical to us are not necessarily for a consumer. So we have to, sometimes take a step back, like you're teaching a school age child, because people just, especially if they've never bought a home, or if they didn't, if they haven't sold a house in 40 years, this works nothing like it did 40 years ago. So you've got to make sure that you don't assume that people understand things that we might find as common sense or logic. Make sure you take the time to actually explain all of them so that you don't leave your client out to dry, being confused, because they're going to look to you, right? Like, if he didn't know any better and it causes issues, he's going to blame Valerie, right? Even though she's not wrong, he's going to blame her because he didn't know any better and she should have told him. Like, that would be his perception. So super valid point.
I don't think I had a transaction that I didn't have a hiccup with. I don't know about you guys, but every transaction has a little thing here and there.
Yes. So that flows perfectly into the next section. We're going to save ahas for the end just because I want to make sure we cover a few points. So I'm going to let Dave jump in, but I'll just say that was something I was going to tell David earlier too, is no matter how long you've been doing this and how many transactions you've done, literally every transaction, something different is going to happen. Okay. Either a process is different, there's going to be a stressful situation. There's going to be a question you've never asked. There's going to be a document you've never seen. There's going to be something in every single transaction that's new to you. That's totally normal. So don't feel like that makes you don't know what you're doing or you need more experience. I've been doing it for 10 years and I literally every single transaction, like the seller being there at the home inspection, I'm like, I just never thought about how uncomfortable that could be. Like every single transaction, you're going to learn something new. So Dave, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Woo. Yeah, there's it's funny. I think it was David's question earlier. It's like, when did you feel like you knew what you were doing? Every single deal, every single time I learned something new. I just learned 11 years I've been doing this. I grew up, I don't know if you guys all know the town, but the town is called Smithfield, Rhode Island. I grew up in that town. I lived there for 30 years. I've done plenty of business there. Only in my most recent transaction, which closed 3 weeks ago, did I learn that in Smithfield, any house built after 1976 has to have smoke detectors that communicate with each other, either hardwired or Bluetooth wireless. I didn't know that. So when the fire department came to do the smoke cert, I was kind of caught with my pants down. And all the deals that I've ever done in Smithfield, I didn't know that. I guess they were all older than 1976. So that was a fun little fact for you guys. So you're never going to know everything. Just kind of double down on that point. So just because we're kind of abutting towards the end of our session this morning anyway, unless you guys want to hang out until like 2 PM. We've actually, Melanie's like, no, we've hit a lot, like in our discussion, which thank you guys for participating and being active. We've hit a lot of instances where we can avoid risk. So all of this like risk avoidance stuff, we don't want to dive too deep into because we've hit a lot of the specifics, but if we could just direct you to the slide that is on your page right now, communicating clearly, communicating often, communicating in a way that you set forth with your seller is going to be a massive way to keep stress low. Remember, we talked about most money for your sellers anyway, most time, least money, least stress. It's a great way to keep stress down is communicate with them in a way that they want to be communicated with. I have had sellers who are like, Dave, I don't care if you have an update. Tell me something every day. Even if you have to tell me you don't have an update, tell me something every day. And that's exactly what I would do. If I didn't have an update, I would have an alarm that says, text Chris and Tammy, no update. And that's exactly what I would do. So make sure that you do that and set the expectations to point number 2. Set the expectation that that's how you're going to behave. That's how you're going to run your business. That's how your interaction with your client is going to be. Your best opportunity for this expectation setting is at your listing presentation or your buyer consultation. Ask your seller, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, how often would you like me to communicate with you? Would you like me to share a non-update update with you or only tell you when there are things that you need to know? Any answer is fine. You're in the business of client service, so you're going to serve those people in that way, right? Guys, maintain your professionalism throughout the entire transaction. Anybody ever see Millionaire? What is it called? $1 Million Listing on Bravo. Anybody actually think that that's how realtors should behave in the wild, so to speak? Absolutely not. We should not be going to parties and throwing wine on each other and getting the fist fights at open houses. This is not how this works. Even if the other person thinks that and they want to be a mudslinger and they want to talk a lot of trash, they want to be a complicator versus a facilitator, you can be better than that. As a Keller Williams agent who believes in the 4 YC2Ts, you are operating with an integrity, you are operating in win-win relationships for the benefit of all parties. Maintaining your professionalism is how you do that. And those of you who do business in Rhode Island, guys, Rhode Island is a postage stamp. We all know who each other are. So if you're the
Yes,
agent,
if you need referrals there, call me. Just saying.
I was already fishing for referrals in our chats earlier, Melanie. So I already got one. So big ups. So just make sure that you're the one that everybody's like, oh, Dave Nielsen. Yeah, I did a deal with him. Super professional, really easy. Because we all know somebody who knows somebody, right? Lastly, the point earlier was brought up about client gifts. I personally do like to give gifts. I only give them if they're like personalized. Like I don't always, I like if it's like I don't just like grab a bottle of wine all the time, and that's fine. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with a bottle of wine, assuming that your client is okay with that. But I don't have like one thing that I always do. It's tailored to the client, because what I'm going to do is immediately upon closing, I'm going to ask that client to write a review for me. no matter what side of the transaction I'm on, buy side or sell side, most likely the juncture with which that client is most happy with me and my service is at the closing table. That buyer finally gets that set of keys in their hands. That seller finally is done thinking about moving, and now it's just thinking about that big check they're about to get or that big problem they just solved. They've never been happier with you than right in that moment. So, hey, listen, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I'm not going to ask you a lot for the rest of our lives, but one thing I am going to ask that you do, my business is fueled by referrals. I would love it if you would put a review on my website or on realtor.com or Zillow or wherever your reviews live. I would love it if you did that and just helped out my business. That's the only thing I'll ever ask of you. And then
And
they
guys,
comment
set
on it.
yourself, sorry, I was just gonna jump in, set yourself up to ask them for more business, right? Like some of us tend to, and I used to be this way, some of us tend to feel weird about asking for more business. Like, who else do you know that wants to buy or sell, right? They want to help you, and you've just done a really great job at helping them buy, sell, or invest in real estate. They're going to want to give your name to other people so they can experience the same awesomeness that they just experienced. And if you don't ask, they may not think of it. And now their friend or family member is going to end up with an agent that's not as great as you, right? So don't be afraid. Set it up right at the table. This was such a great transaction. I'm so grateful that we got to do this together. Thank you so much for letting me be a part of it. You know, like you, who do you know?
Is she freezing or is that just me?
She's freezing.
She's freezing out.
All right, Mel.
This might auto shut off though, Dave. I'm wondering.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I hate to do this. I have a client in that I'm actually 4 minutes late for. So allow me to throw out a final thought just on this, guys. Our business is all new, repeat, or referral. If you're going to get new, repeat, or referral business, it's going to come from avenues like this, asking for reviews, communicating with the clients when they're happy with you. And those of you who have had closings before and maybe didn't think of asking for reviews in that moment, what a great reason to reconnect with that client. Call them up and be like, hey, I actually just built my website out and there's a spot for reviews. I'd love it if you could go through and just leave a couple words about how happy you were with my service. It's a great way to do that. So if we could just share an aha or two, and then we can all kind of like move on with our day, get ready to generate leads and get closer to our next closing. How do you guys think?
Thank you both for your time. Do you want, are you working towards that instructor level or whatever for reviews?
No,
But
thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. If you want to write Matt and Nate and tell them what a great job we did, that would be great.
All right. Who are they? Who are Matt and Nate?
Oh my gosh, David Nielsen.
Yeah, you guys don't. We're not on first name basis with everybody in the region. I can't believe it.
I'll put my info in the chat. Write the review,
Regional.
send it to me, and I'll get it to the regional directors.
For New England region.
Yeah.
Yeah.
These guys are rock stars. And if you want to build your profit share downline, you got anybody for Rhode Island, send them my way. I will make sure they go into your downline.
And get trained by us.
Absolutely.
Cool.
I already communicated with Jason, but anybody else that wants to throw business my way, I will reciprocate with you guys. And give you
Where are you in Cali, Roland?
I'm in Valencia, California,
Okay.
and I also represent Antelope Valley, if that anybody knows that site. My office is in Antelope Valley, but I have a large
Did you say Antelope Valley?
Antelope Valley, yeah,
Okay. So is that near Palmdale, Lancaster?
that's exactly what it is.
Yeah. So I lived there for a short time.
Why did you leave and go to the cold weather?
Well, I'm from here, and I went to Cali I was young and young and dumb, and I had to come back home.
We went from 180,000